This podcast has not been sanctioned.
The battleground was Monday nights.
80.
For a campaign of 83 consecutive weeks.
3.
There was a clear winner in this historic war.
Weeks.
This is the story of that campaign.
83 weeks.
20 years later, the time has come for the whole truth. This is 83 Weeks with
Eric Bischoff and Conrad Thompson.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. Eric, what's going on, man? How are you?
I am wonderful. It is another day in paradise. I am still reeling, rocking, and rolling off all of the great news that we had last week, the success of the show. Thank you very much to Team Conrad for all of the support, and to all the listeners for making this fun as hell.
You know, a friend of ours used to go on TBS every week and say, "What's causing all this?" And man, I got to tell you, I'm pretty fired up considering that, you know, you wake up a month in and we're the #1 show on Westwood One. Fuck, what a fun deal we're doing here, man. I'm having fun and people are digging it, and I'm excited to beat you up because they loved when I did it last week.
Yeah, you know, and I was thinking a lot about last week, and look, you know, you've only been working with me for a month, but you know, you knew me a little bit before that. And when I'm right, I'll fight my ass off. I really will. Or when I think I'm right. And just because I think I'm right doesn't mean I am. It's just I believe I am.
Right.
But when I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And at the end of the show, I've just got a little ground I'd like to cover with you and wrap up some business.
Okay. Well, stay tuned for that, and be sure to check out next week here on the show because, man, we have got a lot of fun coming up for you today. I guess we should go ahead and mention that the reality is that today is going to be our best show ever because it's all about Chris Jericho. And I've looked forward to this one.
He made the list. He made the list.
There you go. I like it. I've been looking forward to this one for quite a while just because I think his story is so interesting. But we're not done with the fun topics. The hits keep coming. Next week, tune in for Dusty Rhodes. The following week, Clash of the Champions 23, which you might think, what the hell is that show? It's Eric's first major Clash of the Champions in charge. It's even his first pay-per-view like this. I mean, it's the first time you really start to see some of the things fall into place. Of course, Slamboree we'll circle back to another time, which is maybe the biggest snafu of pay-per-views from 93. But Clash of the Champions 23, that's what we're doing on June 18th. And then it's all about the Great American Bash. And you get to pick. And stay tuned for a poll on that. If you haven't already, follow us on Twitter. It's at 83 Weeks. And of course, you can see Eric defend himself on Twitch, live and in color, baby. It's twitch.tv/83 Weeks. Let's get started about why we're really here, though. Chris Jericho. And of course, I think everybody is waiting for us to talk about why Chris left. But first, let's talk about how Chris came in. He had a lot of buzz in the mid-90s. And a lot of people assumed that he might actually show up sooner than he did because you developed a bit of a reputation for finding talent like this and signing them to WCW. But it takes him actually going through ECW, and then allegedly you see him at the World Peace Festival in AAA, and that's where you first sort of figure out who Chris Jericho is and extend an offer. Is that the way you remember it going down?
I wasn't aware of Chris at all in ECW, much, to the chagrin of my good, close personal friend and the advocate of Brock Lesnar, Paul Heyman. I didn't watch any. I watched zero. In fact, I don't even think I could get ECW in Atlanta in my cable package back then. So I really wasn't paying attention to him in ECW. I know other guys were. I think Terry Taylor probably was. I think Kevin Sullivan probably was, but I wasn't. And that's not where I became aware of him. I became aware of him really after I hired Benoit, Malenko, Guerrero, and made a commitment to build that Cruiserweight division. From what I recall, it was really their input and them kind of putting Jericho on my radar, which is one of the reasons why I went to the event in Los Angeles. One of the reasons, not the sole reason, but was to check him out.
So, of course, Jericho's doing whatever he can to get noticed, and he makes trips through Japan and Mexico, and really, Japan is where the big buzz starts. He has the stint in ECW that we referenced, and then Allegedly, when you finally get a chance to meet him at the World Peace Festival, the deal comes about pretty easy. He even wrote about it, and he basically said something like, quote, "Benoit's been recommending you like crazy, and that's enough for me. Do you want to come work for me in WCW?" And that was it. After years of toiling away in foreign countries, high school gyms, bowling alleys, and bingo halls, I'd finally been given the golden ticket to work in the United States. Quote, "Here's my number. Call my secretary. We'll arrange a meeting and make a deal." I couldn't believe how quickly it had transpired. So this is sort of Jericho's account from his book of this first initial meeting. And you sort of were, fucking Willy Wonka of wrestling in the United States in this era, because you were taking chances on guys who really probably wouldn't have had the same opportunity to work with Vince McMahon. And even if they
not really, probably not in a fucking lifetime at that point.
Yeah.
They were hiring monsters. I was making and had made. By that time, we were well into the cruiserweight division, and I was committed to that division. So yeah, I was making deals for guys that had great reputations, guys who, and I wasn't just Chris Benoit. I talked to Brad Ringens. I talked to a number of people who knew of Chris. They didn't know him personally as well as Benoit did, but I had a lot of good responses, and he got a highly favorable response from just about everybody I talked to. But yeah, I wasn't taking chances on them. I was actively looking for that kind of talent to build that division.
So let's talk through that, because a lot of people sort of take you to task for the decision to sign what is effectively, for lack of a better word, a lot of older talent that had really made their name and their claim to fame on Vince's TV. But yet at the same time, you're also the guy who's doing what you just said. You're signing the Benoits and the Jerichos. Was this you trying to find a delicate balance of these are proven draws that are recognizable on a national landscape, and that may get people to actually check it out? But if we have this sort of wrestling talent on the underneath, they'll stick around. Is that part of the strategy, or am I way off base?
No, you're not way off base. You're close, but it was broader than that. I had made up my mind that Nitro had to have a more diverse presentation. And look, we're talking about 96, we're talking about 97. Those were hugely profitable years for WCW. And so anybody that wants to take me to task for relying on the older guys just need to remember that those were the years when we were kicking the WWF's ass as badly as ever. And we were making money hand over fist. So remember that. But also, especially when we had a 3-hour show, I knew there was a couple things. One is I wanted to break it up. I wanted Nitro to represent a more international vibe. I wanted to have a strong Japanese presence on my show, which is why I did the deal with New Japan and why I was so committed to that deal the way that I was. And there was other reasons too. It helped me offset some of my talent expense, because every time I would send talent over to New Japan, they would pay me the equivalent of that talent's salary. So instead of carrying someone for 52 weeks a year, I may only carry him for 42 weeks or 32 weeks, or depending on how often the talent went over there. So it was a way to offset some of my talent expense, but it was also a way for me to bring some Japanese talent over under that relationship, so that our show had a more international feel, which the WWF clearly did not have. It was the same reason why I brought a lot of the Mexicans in, because I wanted that lucha vibe and that presence and that international feel in our show. But in addition to the international feel, the cruiserweight division for me, and it's one of the reasons why I always had it in the middle of the 3-hour show. It always kicked off when it was 3 hours. It always kicked off right at 9 o'clock, because we would set up our stories in the first hour. More often than not, we would have some of our, I'll call them preliminary, undercard stories, angles, matches, if you will, exposing talent. And the show would theoretically, more often than not, especially during that time, it would build and it would build. but I conditioned the audience to know that at 9 o'clock, shit was going to hit the fan because that's where I positioned the cruiserweights in our format. And I did it intentionally because I knew the action would be faster. It would be more dynamic. It would be completely different than what we were going to see in the main event. And that was such an important, that was the underlying motivation for the cruiserweight division, because everybody was doing the same things. Just like right now, when you watch, Monday Night Raw or SmackDown, everybody's basically doing the same things and wrestling the same style. There is very little diversity in the presentation of that show. There's diversity in the characters and the storylines and all that. I'm not knocking them. It's not what I'm here for. But when you look at that show and you look at the moves and you look at the presentation, it's kind of all the same. And I had that problem with Nitro, and I really believe that, and I go to my grave believing and knowing that the cruiserweight division was designed to provide a completely diverse presentation at that 9 o'clock hour. So when someone sat down and made a 3-hour commitment to Nitro, they knew they were going to get some of the younger talent, some of the newer storylines, some of the beginning of angles. They knew at 9 o'clock shit was going to hit the fan, and they were going to see some of the most athletic, fastest paced wrestling they'd ever seen anywhere, because outside of Nitro, it didn't exist on a consistent basis on any major platform like ours. And then, of course, we would satisfy the audience that liked those older guys that, by the way, were allowing me to kick the WWF's ass. So it was it was just like going to a buffet where everything on the buffet was outstanding. You may not like the prime rib, but you loved the salmon. And that's what that was.
Well, people loved it. That's for sure. And it led to a pretty interesting exchange, because this is really the first time that Jericho has a big break like this. And he even wrote in his book that he was pretty nervous to actually meet you once he takes you up on your offer to fly to Atlanta. He says you showed up, gave off maybe an arrogant vibe, and says you were in jeans and cowboy boots and a leather jacket, and it just didn't really fit what his perception of the head of a multi-million-dollar company would be. And he says you got straight to the point. Says you didn't want to bullshit him, and you really wanted him to come work for WCW, and even compared him to Shawn Michaels, sort of insinuating that you could be our WCW's Shawn Michaels. But then you also said, I'd love to see a Jericho Brad Armstrong feud. I really see this Armstrong Jericho thing. And I don't know why, but in hindsight, that sort of made me laugh. When you guys actually get down to the money part of the conversation, you just hit him with it. What type of money are you looking for? What is your expectation? And he asked for what he believes is an astronomical amount of money. He had been making about $50,000 between all of his other efforts in Japan and Mexico and the independents. He asked for $100,000, and you counter with 135. You raise it right away because you said, I sort of see you in the vein of Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit. And here's what those guys are making. So I'll bring you in for that and then kick you another, 30,000 or so to relocate to Atlanta. And he's just bugging out at, oh my God, this is so much more money than I imagined. And even wrote in his book, I'd just been exposed to the magical generosity of ATM Eric. What can you tell us about that day you guys met, probably at Jack and Jill's in Atlanta at the bottom of CNN Tower, and sort of beat up the negotiation process here? I like Chris. Chris and I are good friends. And if he was sitting, at the table with me right now, I would say the same thing that I'm about to say to you. Chris Jericho is really great at putting himself over. In fact, There's nobody better at putting over Chris Jericho than Chris Jericho. And it's often the case when guys write these books, they're not writing facts. They're not writing details that do anything other than put themselves over and put over the people they're working for, by the way, when they're publishing that book. Because it was the WWE that published it. That narrative that you just described fits the ATM Eric narrative that had been so prevalent for so long when, everybody that was leaving WCW and trying to get over with WWE would pound that. And it was because the core of that narrative is that the only reason Eric Bischoff was able to defeat the WWF is because he had Ted Turner's money. The core of that narrative is bullshit.
It's false. I beat the WWF because I was smarter, because I was more creative, because I took a chance on a formula that disrupted the way that the WWF had been producing wrestling and WCW for decades. And the disruption of that formula forced WWF at that time to copy our formula. It was the formula that beat WWF. It wasn't Ted Turner's money. And by the way, it wasn't like I walked into to bust the narrative, because to do a good job answering your question, I'm going to have to bust the narrative. The narrative was all Ted Turner wanted to do was put WWF out of business. Wrong. Number one. Number two, the day that I took over WCW, nobody came into me and said, "Hey, Eric, just let us know how much money you want. You got it, brother." That's bullshit. That is there is nothing more antithetical to the truth than that. When I took over WCW, I was given a mandate. Don't fuck it up in terms of PR.
Right.
Because Bill Watts had done such a phenomenal job of burning down the public relations house of WCW. Nobody in that entire fucking company, almost Ted Turner included, who was the last holdout of people that was going to give us one more shot. Everybody else wanted to burn WCW to the ground and pretend it never existed. Not because it was losing $10 or $12 or $15 million a year on $24 million worth of gross revenue. That's not what they were pissed off about. They were pissed off about all the other stupid shit that Bill Watts did. That's what I inherited. And guess what? When I inherited it, the first thing that I did was cut out house shows. Why? Because they were losing fucking money. Why did I do that? Because I knew if I didn't stop the bleeding financially, I was never going to get another nickel added to our budget. Conrad, in a director's meeting one day, sat down at the table. There's probably 6 or 8 department heads sitting at the table with me. And I said, every one of you get up right now, go to your desks, come back and tell me how many pencils you have in your desk. And they all looked at me like I was stoned. And they all came back and they told me. And my response to them, and I can't remember word for word, sorry for all of you haters out there, it was 20 fucking years ago, but my response, as I paraphrase myself, was great. Now you know how many pencils you have, because those are assets. And if you don't know what your assets are, you can't possibly try to run this business profitably. That was my way of making the point, is that we had to cut the guts out of it. We had to stop the bleeding in order to build it back up again. And I was under so much scrutiny when I took over in 94, 95, even when Chris came in 96, man, they were not handing out money. I had started getting a little bit more. They were giving me more and more of a budget because I was proving myself. I proved myself in 94 93 really, when I forced the issue to cut out the house shows. Pissed a lot of people off. A lot of the boys hated my guts for doing it because they were scared. But it was my opinion then, and it is now. If I had to do it all over again, yes, I would do the same fucking thing. Because the prevailing logic when I took over the company, and Bob Dew, God bless him, good guy. I'm friends with his daughter. Sorry, Lori, I'm about to tell the truth. Bob Dew, his solution to losing money in house shows was to do more house shows. I would argue with him. This is why I ended up becoming president of the company. I would say, Bob, we lose money every time we go out the fucking door. Every time we go out the door, we lose money. So your solution is to go out the door more often. That's the kind of stuff that I had to fight in 93, in 94, in 95. It's one of the reasons why I took the shows, the syndicated shows, off of the road that were extremely expensive to produce, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't afford it, and I had to save money. I had to take those shows off the road and put them in the Disney MGM studios. It was a horseshit choice in many respects for the wrestling fan, for the talent, although there was some upside to it, clearly. But from a production point of view, other than the visuals, it was really hard to do it from a storytelling point of view. But we had no choice because ultimately it saved us money. And the combination of these money-saving decisions that I was making in 94 and 95 started to loosen up the purse strings, because I was starting to show a trend, or at least a trajectory, that we could at least break even. And it wasn't until I started proving that trajectory financially that I started getting a little bit more money to spend. So that's the truth. But the narrative guys like Mick Foley and so many others, that because they wanted to retell that narrative because it got them over. I was a heel, both on camera and in real life to them. You couldn't get yourself over faster, whether you're Stone Cold Steve Austin, or whatever he was when he went to WCW, or Mick Foley, or anybody else, or Chris Jericho when you go to WWE. What the fuck you think these guys are going to say? No, you guys got it all wrong about Eric Bischoff. He actually did some pretty amazing things in WCW, and I'm really glad he gave me a chance to get the exposure. Otherwise, I might not be here. How long do you think Chris Jericho would have lasted in that locker room?
Right.
So when we go through this stuff, the audience, I'm not talking about you, Conrad, although you're probably one of them, but, when I say things like context is king, and I emphasize context, you've got to kind of go back and look at those times and look at the facts versus the bullshit that was written, whether it's in a book or whether it's in Dave Meltzer's dirt sheet, because it's not all true. And there's elements to truth to it. And let's talk about an element while I'm answering your 3-part question in this long fucking winded answer. Oh my God, damn, I'm getting thirsty already. But yes, I did offer Chris what I offered Dean and Eddie.
That's what I wanted to ask, is what's the strategy there? Because it feels like, you went to the
Here's the strategy. It's really simple, bro. Oh God. Oh, bro. Oh. It's really simple. When Eddie and Dean and Chris came in to talk about a deal, they came in together.
Right.
That was part of their deal. They weren't going to negotiate individually, and I wasn't going to try to split them up. I wasn't going to work one against the other and make them paranoid, and it's just not the way I did business then or now.
Right.
I'm pretty transparent about the way I do things. And when they came in, they wanted to come in together. I knew exactly the roles I wanted them to play. I knew exactly how much money I had in my budget to pay them. I knew exactly what my expectations of them were, and I agreed to pay them all equally. And that was the number that we arrived at. So when I brought Chris in with the full intention of having Chris at that same level as those guys, the last thing I want to do is lowball a guy so that once he gets there and he finds out after he's been there for a couple of weeks from his close personal friends, Chris Benoit and Eddie and Dean, that they're making 40% more than he is or 20% more than he is, then I got a pissed off camper. And I didn't want that. I wanted to try to create a parity, if you will, with certain guys as often as I could. You couldn't always do that, especially with their top guys. But with what these guys were at that point, as talented and amazing as they all ended up being later on as a result of the opportunities that they all got on Nitro because of the Cruiserweight division. But at the time when they first stepped into WCW, they were relatively speaking unknowns outside of very devoted hardcore wrestling audience. The mainstream audience didn't know who they were. We had to build that. But I paid them fairly because I knew what they were going to do and I knew where they were going to go. And I wanted to treat Chris fairly. So if that makes me a bad guy, if that makes me ATM Eric so that it fits into a really cutesy little narrative that Chris wanted in his book, so be it.
Well, in fairness, and I appreciate that you're popping off, this is why people are listening, but if a guy asks for a certain number and it's less than you were thinking you were going to pay him, if you are supposed to, if you're trying to sort of be a good steward to the company with this cash that you've been entrusted with, what's wrong with just giving him what he wanted?
What's wrong with lowballing him because he doesn't know what the other guys are making?
Hang on now.
What's wrong with bringing him in and paying him less than his friends when a month later he's going to go, what the fuck? You took advantage of me? Why are these guys making more? I'm worth more? Because that's exactly what would have happened.
Well, but in the wrestling business, there is that whole, You don't talk to anybody else about how much they're making.
Oh, really? You speaking from experience now.
No, I'm saying
because that wasn't the situation back then.
Well,
that wasn't the situation I was faced with.
It certainly wasn't with guys like Hall and Nash, but in the old school era, you sort of kept what you were getting paid close to the vest because you didn't want to upset the apple cart, because there's really no good comes from talking about it. I mean, if you make more or you make less than your friend, either way, there are hurt feelings. So I've always been told that back in the day, guys made it a point to try to not to discuss it because almost no good comes from it.
Yeah, that may have been what you were told. Let me have been told. Let me tell you what I actually had to deal with. What I actually had to deal with was the exact opposite. The exact opposite.
Give me an example of two guys who took.
I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to name names, and not because I'm just not going to name names. But there were, and I'm not talking about Scott Hall and Kevin Nash and
sure.
X-Pac and anybody else, okay, that came in later, because I became even a bigger issue later on, and I was faced with even more of that. But there was a huge, in addition to the fact that Bill Watts had burned the company almost to the ground, and they were ready to pull the plug, and WCW was on its last breath when they handed me the keys and said, okay, you kid, you do it, because nobody else wanted it, quite frankly, and I was too stupid to know better. The morale in that company, and I was one of them. I was a talent. I wasn't in management when Watts was there or when Hurd was there. I was not one of the boys. I wasn't a wrestler, but as an announcer, I was a talent, and I heard every syllable of it. I listened to all of it. I listened to guys talking about their freaking money back in the dressing rooms. So don't tell me what you've been told. I'll tell you what I heard and what I dealt with later on. It's just not true. It escalated. It became even more of a problem, but I knew, especially in 94, in 95, and without question in 96. Now, because I'm bringing in the Halls and the Nashes, and I'm bringing in more guys, I was even more sensitive to parity and keeping things at least on a level playing field, because I didn't want the kind of chaos and horrible attitude that I had to experience when I was a talent in the locker room. It's exactly what I was trying to avoid. So I'm sorry. I don't buy the bullshit. Not gonna accept it. It's not true. I listened to it when I was a talent.
All right, let's keep it moving here and talk about the proposed feud that you saw and you made in your pitch. I've always been fascinated around these initial conversations that a quote unquote booker, whoever's running the company, has.
What year was that?
This would have been 1996. Of course, Chris made his debut in August 26th, on Nitro. And that's when we first see him. So it would have happened probably summer of 96. I guess, what I'm curious about is, because this is the dream gig for so many guys. And Chris even remarks about how easy it was. You saw him in person and said, hey, call my secretary. We're going to get you to Atlanta and try to figure something out.
But again, let's perspective.
Sure.
Yeah, it was easy for him because I'd already made up my mind. I didn't need to play games and make him work for it. He'd been endorsed by everybody that I had talked to. I talked to Masa Saito on a regular basis. Masa was excited about me bringing him over because Masa felt that he could, and when I say Masa, I mean Masa and Brad Ringens, who was the American agent at the time and a very close friend of mine that I grew up with in high school. They were all excited about Chris. So it wasn't like I had to sit. And by the way, I didn't wear my leather jacket to the office, just for the record. I did wear jeans and occasionally I wore cowboy boots. But unless it was like January and I was on my motorcycle, I didn't wear a leather jacket to the office. It sounds good though, right? Because that's what I wore on camera. kind of see what's going on there. But hey, it's a book. You got to write. It's got to be entertaining. Got to get yourself over. I get it.
All right, Eric, I need to take a time out here to tell everybody about the magical website, hidefromrent.com. I mean, I say it's magic, and it kind of is, because it turns a renter into a homeowner with no money down man, it sounds too good to be true, but we routinely find a way to get renters into a brand new house with no money down. And here's maybe the best part. Your new house payment, it's roughly what you've been paying in rent. I mean, if you're a renter, why wouldn't you want to own a house for roughly the same monthly payment? We can make that whole process for you fast and easy. You don't need perfect credit. You don't need money out of your pocket. What are you waiting for? Stop throwing your money away and make this the summer that you do something for your family, and do it with First Family. Me, Conrad Thompson, and First Family Mortgage, we'd be proud to help you navigate this, and you can find out how easy it is right now in just a few simple clicks at hidefromrent.com. And let me just say, if you're coming up on the end of your lease, you really owe it to yourself to check into this. Home prices are on the rise. Interest rates are on the rise. What does that mean for you? It means if you wait another year, you're going to wind up paying more. You'll pay more for the house, and you'll pay more for your financing. But a couple of clicks right now at hidefromrent.com, and we can make it happen for you, even cheaper than if you were to find a new apartment today. You see, if you found another apartment today, you'd have to pay your first month's rent and your last month's rent and a security deposit. But at hidefromrent.com, man, you're in for no money down. And hey, even if you've got questions about your credit, that's what we're here for. We would love to help you get a plan together today. Maybe you can't buy right now, but you're going to want to eventually, and there's no better time to start than right now. I'm telling you, this is fast and easy. And this with me, Conrad Thompson. Hidefromrent.com is where you need to go. NMLS number 65084, Equal Housing Lender.
But there, yeah, it was easy for Chris.
Well,
he'd been put over by everybody whom I respected. I saw him in LA, and yeah, he came in. I had a pretty good idea what I wanted to do with him. I didn't need to waste an hour playing games.
And what you're so excited to bring him in for is a feud with Brad Armstrong.
I'm not buying that. I'm not buying that.
Okay.
I'm not buying it. Brad, I brought him in to work with Chris and Dean and Eddie in the Cruiserweight division. I wanted to work him into that role. I wasn't going to like launch him right into the middle of it. Not a lot of people, I know Chris is not going to want to hear that. And yes, he worked in ECW, and maybe 300,000 people watched that on TSN or whatever the cable station was that nobody watched, or on their syndicated show that nobody could find. Yeah, he worked there, but our audience, our 4 or 5 million people, didn't know who he was. So it takes a while to expose a guy and build a guy. But the role that I wanted him for, and I told him this, was in the serious mix of the Cruiserweight division.
Let's talk about the first match. He starts by working Mr. JL, which is Jerry Lynn. And that taping happens on August 20th. It's a Saturday night taping, of course. And the assistant booker is here. And of course, we're talking about everybody's favorite, Terry Taylor. And he says that Terry Taylor comes to him and says that, they want you to be a babyface. And Jericho would write that he feels like this sort of dooms him from the start because he thinks you were a little bit behind the curve compared to like an ECW at the time.
Oh yeah, I was really behind the curve. That fucking NWO thing just wasn't working at all. I just did not have a feel for shit, but go ahead.
He says that you were booking him as a nameless, faceless babyface, in that there were lots of good guys or bad guys. There weren't as many shades of gray, especially when it came to the underneath guys. So he goes out, has a match with Mr. JL, and he says the match went over like a dump in church. It was a horrible Red Reels debut, and everyone knew it, except me. The chastising began the minute I walked through the curtain when Orndorff, who was waiting for me, said, "Damn it, boy, you need a fancy ring robe with gems and sequins on it." And he says when he saw Terry Taylor, he says, "Wow, did that ever suck? Was that your first match ever? It was terrible. What were you trying to accomplish?" And Jericho allegedly says, "Since I was winning the match, I wanted to make JL look good in the process." And Terry quipped, "That match wasn't for him. It was for you to show what you can do. And from the look of things, you can't do much. I don't even know if we can show what you did on TV." Is this something that Terry Taylor was tasked with to sort of break them in on Saturday night? What was the feedback you got about this? Your response to this overall debut with WCW from Jericho's book?
I don't remember his first match. There's no way I could.
Right.
It's just not fucking possible. And unless we wanted to sit down and watch the show together, it would be hard for me to express an opinion. So I'll just have to take what he says. Although, I think the whole idea of Eric being a little bit behind the curve in terms of what was really going on, given the fact that that I single-handedly at that point with the NWO turned the entire fucking business upside down, and we're still feeling that today. So I think that's an indication of the perspective from which Chris Jericho was writing this book. Just keep that in mind. Now, that being said, just reminding the audience, I'll take Chris's version of his first match at face value. I could hear Terry Taylor responding like that. Terry came up with Bill Watts. He was that older school guy, and Terry Taylor had like two sides to him. He could be the most likable, charming, just great guy to be around, and he could be just a nuclear prick, and it all depended, and I think, and I didn't hear Terry talk to talent a lot. Again, he was the agent. He was working for Kevin Sullivan, who was the booker at the time, right? I didn't get in the middle of a lot of that, so I didn't hear Terry talk to talent. I heard Terry talk to me, but of course, when he talked to me, he talked much differently, right? Of course, than he would when he talked to talent. So, but I'll take Chris's version of that because I don't remember it. I wasn't there to remember it or not remember it. I wasn't present. I guess it could be accurate.
It's funny because when he runs into Chris Benoit the very next day, Benoit gets all over him and says something like, "What the fuck happened in Dalton? Terry told me that you stunk the joint out, and the word going around is that you aren't any good." And he continued, "You have to dress nicer too. You're wearing shorts and a tank top. You look like a slob. This is the big leagues. Act like it." Now, this is years before the dress code had been instituted, but it is sort of locker room etiquette, at least from Chris Benoit's standpoint. Were there conversations from you or from other guys about how to sort of carry yourself backstage or in real life? Or is that not something that was even remotely on your radar at the time?
It wasn't on my radar. I think it probably was Chris's. Chris was very unique in that respect. I think Chris Benoit had his own kind of ethical moral code when it came to the way he conducted himself, when he was in the building. I could, thinking back, could I hear Chris Benoit saying that to Chris Jericho? Absolutely. Because he was kind of, Chris Benoit was the leader of that group. He was a silent leader, but he was the Rock of Gibraltar of that group. Dean, Eddie, Chris, Jericho. So I could see that, but from my perspective, no. I mean, that's just no. I was not a big dress code guy.
He wrote about his first match on Nitro, which is when most of us saw him for the first time. He's working with Alex Wright. And when he finds out he's working with Alex Wright, he also learns he's got 8 minutes, and that includes the entrances. And this is going to be his primetime national television debut. And he's got all these great ideas, and he takes them and sort of runs down this list of things he wants to do in the match with Alex Wright. And Alex allegedly says something like, out of the 10 things you want to do, pick your best 3 because that's all we're going to have time for. And he sort of quipped in his book, he was now Dick Murdoch and I was the Japanese young boy. He wasn't being a jerk, just a realist. I think a lot of times people, especially fans, sort of overlook the time constraints of television, because I know from hanging around enough that whenever you guys allocate, hey, here's this match, you've got this many minutes, that includes the entrance and whatever the little post angle is going to be. So if there is something that's supposed to happen after the match, that 8 minutes includes all of that. And by the time you get both guys to the ring, whatever there is post, if there is anything, and the actual match, 8 minutes is probably more like 4.5, 5. Talk us through, the psychology, and we're debuting a guy. We're going to go to a no contest. We're only going to give him a few minutes, and we're going to put him with Alex Wright. Not saying that anything of that is wrong, just trying to understand why you think, okay, this is the way to do it.
I can't, I'm going to answer it two ways.
Sure.
Obviously, I don't have the format from that particular show. I don't know what else was going on that show. I don't know how much time we allocated to other things on that show that may have been more important or maybe not. I don't know. There's too many things I don't know to say, this is why 8 minutes was enough. If we want to sit down and look at the format for that show, I could probably do a better job of answering why he got 8 minutes. But generally speaking, your 8 to 12 minutes was pretty standard. And the idea was you expose that talent, you get them out there on television, you give the announcers a chance to put them over, to establish them, to tell their backstory, to kind of build that character or that piece of talent so that in the weeks or months to come, you're building that talent on a foundation. So yeah, I can see how a guy like Chris, and Chris is always, looking back at it now, I didn't, recognize it as much, when we were in the middle of it all, but Chris is always a guy that has, when he steps into a room or when he steps into the ring, he's got a whole lot of big ideas for himself. And that was one of the reasons why he is where he is today. I admire it. I'm not knocking it. But a lot of times when you're a young talent, you may think that you deserve a lot more time to do a lot more great stuff than you're going to get. And it's just the nature of the beast. It is today. It's always been that way. It's different in a house show. But when you're producing a television show and you've got, in a 2-hour show, you've got 12 matches, you've got, 10 commercial breaks, you've got magazines to sell, pay-per-views to sell, you've got backstage interviews and promos that you need to use to glue all the stories together. You've got a whole lot of business to take care of outside of what happens in the ring. That, it wasn't then, it probably still isn't to this day uncommon for talent to get pissed off when they find out they've only got 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, or 12 minutes even for a match, because they want to do more. They know what they're capable of and they want to do it. And it's a constant struggle.
So one of the things that Jericho's sort of been critical of, and this probably, has him blaming himself as well. He says he didn't really have a character in this early run here in WCW. He's just this white meat babyface. And you sort of see him come into the ring and he's sort of yelling to the fans, "Come on. Yeah." I mean, just really out of place. What the fuck is this lame babyface? And the finish to this debut match on Nitro is sort of the same deal. He's going to be in a count out win situation over Alex Wright, but he doesn't want to win that way. He does a promo with Mean Gene saying, the NWO may take a win like that, but not me. And he says in hindsight, it was really an 8 minutes of self-burial because he's this goody two shoes that really is pretty fucking lame. When a guy like this is debuting, is there a real conversation? We've detailed the money. Is there a real conversation for, here's the type of character I want you to have, here's the fire I want you to have, or is, his presentation, his gear, his mannerisms, his promo style, is that all sort of left up to him for a guy like Jericho here?
It's a little bit of both. Again, I brought him in. My mandate to Kevin and to Terry, Kevin Sullivan and Terry Taylor, was I wanted Chris Jericho to come in. I want him to be an important part of the Cruiserweight division. That was my input, right? The Cruiserweight division, if you go back and look at it, Chris Benoit didn't have a gimmick. Dean Malenko didn't have a gimmick.
Right.
Eddie Guerrero, when we brought him in, didn't have a gimmick. The Mexicans did because they were Mexican and they brought their culture with them, which was different than what we did here in the States. But the core guys, we were kind of gimmick free at that moment. The NWO, we used their real names. They didn't have robes and flashing lights and all of the gaga that had been so commonplace, in the decades prior to that. That's what I was getting away from. So no, we didn't have a crew of people like we did with Glacier, for example, sit down and say, okay, this is what we want him to look like. And we want him to come out looking like Elvis, only kind of a badass. And we want him to set puppies on fire and stomp them out on the way to the ring because he's just that mean of a person. No, we didn't do that. it was partially up to him to get himself over and to find his character, much like Bill Goldberg did, much like a lot of people did. Maybe not a lot. Maybe the ones that just got over. Diamond Dallas Page, I stripped him of his gimmicks. He didn't get over until we got rid of all of his gimmicks. He was a walking gimmick fucking festival, for God's sake. He looked like a walking, talking flea market when he came to the ring. And it wasn't until we pulled all of that stuff off of him and made him just a blue-collar guy, then he got over. So the prevailing tone and tenor, at least from my point of view, was not to have a guy come in with some kind of pre-made, manufactured, just add water type of character. A lot of it was feeling it out. But again, keep this in mind. I brought him in to be in the Cruiserweight division. None of the core guys in the Cruiserweight division had gimmicks. They performed.
Well, let's talk about when they did perform. It's his pay-per-view debut here, September 15th, 1996 at Fall Brawl. He's working with Benoit, and Benoit pins him in 14 minutes and 36 seconds. Meltzer calls it the best match on the card. He gives it 4 stars, super high praise. And Jericho would write of the match that they really hoped to have a Jacob-style match where they had, years prior in New Japan, but Kevin Sullivan sort of had other plans, and he wanted 80% of the offense to be for Benoit. They sort of go into business for themselves and do almost a 50-50 style match. And afterwards, Kevin sort of takes him to task for that and says, hey, it was a good match. However, you got in way too much offense. And this sort of, demoralizes Chris a little bit, because he even writes in the book, was I supposed to be the next Shawn Michaels or the next Barry Horowitz? Do you remember the Fall Brawl match at all? I mean, I know that, we have a fun thing we say here on the show. I don't recall. But does this match stick out to you as one being particularly good or indifferent? Because the crowd didn't really get into it, and they didn't enjoy it nearly as much as a Meltzer did. So I'm curious, as a promoter, are you really digging the high quality wrestling, or if the fans thought it was shitty, then fuck it?
No, I liked it. And I remember it vaguely, because that was really the first time. And again, I wanted to build Chris, and I really wanted him to be a part of it. I'm going to keep saying it probably until the next show, but I wanted him to be a part of that core Cruiserweight division. And that was really the first time that I got a chance to see what he was really capable of with a guy in Chris Benoit, who I had a tremendous amount of respect for as a talent. So to me, from what I remember, I was excited about it, not because of the match necessarily or the crowd reaction, because I didn't live or die by one crowd reaction. But I did like what I saw, and it fit the formula that I had laid out in detail to Dean and Eddie and Chris a year in advance, before Chris Jericho even got there. It fit what I was looking for.
Well, it doesn't fit what everybody's looking for. He writes in his book that Scott Hall even approaches him and says, listen, you guys are going way too long and doing too much stuff during your matches. Nobody's paying a dime to see you, so you shouldn't be out there for 20 minutes. Do a short match and hit the showers. And he says Benoit was fired up about this and says, it's not his place to say that. He's just pissed off because he's lazy and he wants us all to be lazy too. Don't listen to him. Chat me up. What do you make of Scott Hall's comments here?
I wasn't there. I don't know if they're true or not. I will take Chris's word for it, because it sounds like something Chris would have said, or Scott would have said, especially at that time. But again, let's put this into a broader context. There were a lot of guys, including Hulk Hogan, who didn't really like the Cruiserweight division. As the Cruiserweight division started getting more and more over, at first nobody cared. It was like, they're bringing in a bunch of smaller guys. Great. They're just flying around the ring. They're not telling any stories, because the prevailing logic and the formula that had been so successful for decades was big stars, big characters, kind of doing the same kind of thing that they'd been doing for years. My position was, no, we have a 3-hour show. We can't have everybody doing the same thing, presenting the same type of match, ergo the Cruiserweight division. Once the Cruiserweight division started getting over,
right,
and the audience started reacting to it, guys like Scott Hall, as great as Scott was at that time, and Hulk and Randy and Lex and a lot of other guys didn't necessarily like the fact that those guys were going out there and putting on, from an athletic point of view, a match that none of them were capable of even coming close to. And it was a problem. So when I say I can imagine Scott saying that, it wasn't just because Scott was a dick, but I think because, and he might have been at that moment, depending on what he was doing at that time, but I can also say that it sounds a lot like some of the logic or the philosophy that a lot of the established guys that came on in the main events on those Nitro shows, essentially following some of the cruiserweight shit. They didn't like following it once they started getting over. So I can see it.
Let's talk about his next pay-per-view. He's going to work Halloween Havoc, and this goes down at MGM Grand in Las Vegas. It's a huge house. You guys are really hitting your stride here. And he loses to 6 here in 9 minutes and 49 seconds. And there is a situation here where Nick Patrick is trying to get over as essentially a heel referee. And that sort of becomes a critical part of the storyline here in the match. Meltzer still dug it though. He gave a 3 1/4 star, but the storyline is Patrick does a fast count here. He was, maybe a year and change early on that. Anyway, coming out of this, they're going to book.
Got to make those smart ass comments, don't you? Just got to go there.
He gets put into a fucking angle with Nick Patrick. And that's just amazing to me that you've got this superstar talent that you're talking about, that you're putting over like crazy here, that you see. But as he heads to World War III, 1996, he's on the pay-per-view again, roll tide on that 3 in a row, but he's working with fucking Nick Patrick. Who booked this shit, man?
I'm going to eat that one because it was the Cruiserweight division. It was the NWO, and I could have easily overridden that, and clearly I didn't. So I'm just going to let that fucking mule kick me right in the head. I'm going to take it.
Well, you need to take it. If you're at home and you'd like to see this, please do. It's Nick Patrick, the fucking referee, working a match with Chris Jericho for 8 minutes. It's World War III, 1996. It's on the WWE network. It's pretty ridiculous. Here we go. We start to cruise, through the rest of the year. And I guess it's worth mentioning, he got a win over Masahiro Chono in December. It was by DQ, but whatever. He works with Benoit on Nitro. Benoit beats him. He also has a match where he wins with Bobby Eaton. He's had a lot of names here that he got wins over and worked with, including, a win over Buff Bagwell in October. So it's not all bad. I'm not painting it that way, but the idea of working with a referee does just sort of tickle me. Chat me up about New Japan, because there's talk that you guys are trying to further that, of course, with Masahiro Chono and a lot of those guys, and they're really high on Chris Benoit. And part of the agreement, or so it seems, is that he's going to be able to sort of bounce back and forth. Is that something that Brad Riggins puts together?
Who's he?
He is Chris Jericho.
No, none of the talent that I had under contract had the ability just to go over to Japan whenever they wanted.
Oh no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, that Brad calls him and says, "Hey, we're going to have you debut as the evil Super Liger in front of 65,000 people at the Tokyo Dome." And allegedly this call happens when there is a working agreement with WCW. So he gets a tape measure, gives them the measurements, and they're supposed to make a version of Liger's famous bodysuit. Do you remember how that came together, or any of that conversation happens?
Well, I wasn't a part of that conversation, and I can't testify to facts entered as evidence that aren't really facts or evidence at this point. Allegedly, this is Chris's recollection. But let me tell you my version of the working relationship. It's not a version; it's the facts. Sonny Ono, we could bring in as a witness to testify. The working relationship that I had with New Japan was that if they wanted particular talent, whether it was Chris Jericho or anybody else, Brad would contact me. I would look at our schedule and what we had going on and determine, before the talent was ever advised, I would determine whether or not it was possible given our situation. And if it was, then Brad could reach out to the talent and start making arrangements. Or I may contact the talent and say, hey, reach out to Brad, depending on who it was. That was protocol. It was never protocol where Brad Ringens would pick up the phone and contact any of the talent that I had under contract and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. Go get fitted for some shit, and we're bringing you over for an event, and I'll tell Eric later on. That's not how it works.
I wasn't insinuating that. I mean, clearly there's a working relationship. I was just curious how he wound up working their super show on January 4th at the Tokyo Dome. He's working a super liger. Of course, it's actually Chris Jericho. He gets a win over Koji Kanemoto, but as was going around a lot during this time, he really failed to impress them. It's not exactly what they're hoping for. He does have a couple of botches and people are not really happy with this. Mark Madden even said on the WCW hotline, Chris Jericho stinks in his first appearance as super liger. Allegedly, when he gets to the locker room, some of the New Japan brass say, hey, we want to hang on to that costume for safekeeping, which is kind of funny. And I just, I wanted to talk a little bit about the New Japan relationship, but we'll take a sidebar because you're clearly fired up about stuff. And
No. I was just trying to put it in again. The way the question came across to me is like Brad Ringens called him up one day and said, hey, go get fitted for a costume. We're going to book you. That just wasn't protocol. And I was trying because I know you wanted to talk about the relationship, how the relationship worked, what the protocol was. And I to this day, I still stay in touch with Masa Chono and his wife. Not Masa Chono, I'm sorry. Oh God, I got my Japanese names mixed up. Masa Saito. I still stay in touch with them. Baijo-san, Mr. Baijo, who was the business side of New Japan when I was doing business there, died about a year ago, and I was asked by the family to write a letter that they wanted to post next to his. I don't want to say it was a grave because he's a Buddhist and they don't have a grave, but they have a memorial, and they wanted, because he valued his relationship with WCW and myself and my family. He wanted his family wanted me to write something. So I'm still very close to some of those people. And I cherish that relationship. It was one of the highlights of my career, to be quite honest with you. I'm happy to talk about it. I just want to talk about it accurately.
Well, I mean, I guess what I was asking is, let's talk about the costume. Do they say, hey, we want to bring one of your guys over and make them a version of one of our characters? I mean, to me, it feels like, from a WCW standpoint, how the fuck are we winning with that?
I wasn't going to tell them how to book. No, that was one of the mistakes that was made prior to me coming to WCW. And let's talk about, because Chris was an important part of my relationship with New Japan, not initially, but eventually. And as I said early on when we started this, New Japan came to me through Brad and Masa Saito, because I talked to Masa a lot. They liked Jericho. They had seen Jericho over in Japan. They knew of Chris Jericho well before I did. Just it's the same reason Chris Benoit ended up and Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko ended up in WCW. It wasn't because I saw them and decided they needed to be here. I knew I wanted Cruiserweight division, but it was really Masa Saito and Brad Ringens who said, okay, we're using Chris Benoit as Black Cat. I think was it Chris or Eddie? One of them was the Black Cat, kind of working under a hood. But they were using Dean and Chris and Eddie, and they're the ones that said, look, if you want a Cruiserweight division, these are the guys you want to use because we can also use them. And now you've got two companies building them. But the last thing that I would have done was made the same mistake guys like Bill Watts had made before me, which is to swerve them and curve them and fuck with their creative. I didn't do that. If they said they wanted to book somebody, my talent had to go over there just like they would anywhere else and do what they were asked to do and be whatever character they were asked to be. I wasn't worried about them getting buried on Japanese television because guess what? In 95 and 96 and 97, nobody here watched Japanese television except for, Dave Meltzer.
There you go. The name you were looking for is Black Tiger. That's who Eddie Guerrero portrayed over there.
Tiger.
There was a Black Cat, but not Eddie Guerrero. And Chris Benoit was Wild Pegasus. So everybody sort of had interesting characters, but Super Liger is what they went with for Jericho. Let's talk about the best pay-per-view of all time. Sold out 1997. We've got Master.
Yeah, got me some fat women.
That's a t-shirt. It might not be by the time you hear this, but it will be soon. Man, let's talk about it. EricBischoff.com is where you can pick up all your fine t-shirts. We've got some fucking awesome designs over there. I'll let you talk about some of them, but stay tuned because Got Me Some Fat Women is coming soon. This is where you talk about t-shirts, Eric. We're trying to sell shit.
T-shirts?
Yeah, man.
T-shirts like Mabel was the third man. The hottest selling t-shirt at ericbischoff.com/pro wrestling tees right now. The t-shirt that if you buy that t-shirt, because we all know Dave Meltzer, the man who knows everything about what was going on in WCW back in 96, he reported, according to my good friend here, Conrad Thompson, reported that Mabel was under consideration to be the third man in the NWO. Well, in honor of that amazing insight and that journalistic integrity, we have got a t-shirt called Mabel Was the Third Man. And not only do we have a t-shirt that honors that the journalism and the integrity of Dave Meltzer, but the profits and the proceeds that I get go directly to his widow. So there you go. And then you've got the You're Fired t-shirt. Not only did I fire Stone Cold Steve Austin long before he became Stone Cold Steve Austin, back then he was Stunning Steve, nonetheless, we'll give it Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, I fired him, and I fired him with a FedEx, and I have a t-shirt to commemorate that decision. A decision, by the way, that Steve Austin is very grateful for to this day, as is the WWE. But wait, there's more. If you order your Fire t-shirt right now, you'll also be wearing a shirt that Sean Waltman is proud to endorse. That's right, it is Sean Waltman approved, the FedEx Fire t-shirt in the colors of FedEx. And of course, we've got Context is King. We've got Easy Does It, and we're going to have more. So go to ericbischoff.com, find the t-shirt that makes you look good.
Let's keep it going. Let's talk about the best pay-per-view of all time. January 25th, 1997. It's NWO Sold Out. Masahiro Chono pins Chris Jericho after 11 minutes. It gets 2 stars. You know, I'm sure we're going to talk about this pay-per-view at some point in the future. Masahiro Chono and Jericho, why did that make sense here?
Give that to me again. I'm trying to visualize it. I'm trying to remember that moment.
Masahiro Chono pinned Chris Jericho in 11 minutes after a Yakuza kick. And of course, Nick Patrick is the referee, and that's the storyline I'm sure we're going for. It gets 2 stars. What'd you think about the pairing of Masahiro Chono and Chris Jericho? Why did that make sense? I asked that specifically because we've sort of insinuated or just flat out said Jericho's here to be a cruiserweight star. Masahiro Chono, anything but a cruiserweight.
Yeah, but Chris also was doing double duty over in Japan. And at that time, the New Japan really wanted an NWO presence, and they wanted a storyline that would extend from the U.S. and build over to New Japan. I can only guess, because it would be guessing without a little bit more information in terms of timing and everything. My guess is it was probably done to help build something for Japan that would extend from the U.S. and from the NWO over there.
I'm glad you say that, because the plan, at least from what Chris understood, was that New Japan, specifically Black Cat, wanted to bring him over for the next tour. And it's going to be a few weeks off of the WCW schedule and on to the New Japan schedule. And even though he's practically begging for it, the request is denied. And Terry Taylor says something like, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and they'll just want you more next time. And allegedly, they tried to cheer him up with some good news. You're going to be the new cruiserweight champion. And Chris wrote, instead of happy, happy, joy, joy, my heart sank. Cruiserweight was a dirty word in WCW, a derogatory term. The belt meant as much as a belt from J.C. Penney. If I'd been given a choice, I would have just gone back to Japan. But alas, there was no choice. What do you think of his response of being disappointed he couldn't go to New Japan and that the cruiserweight title was really the equivalent of a J.C. Penney belt?
Man, I'm surprised to hear him say that. And look, he felt the way he felt. I can't get into his head back in 1996 or 97 or whenever this was and comment on how he felt. It's disappointing that he would write that, because that cruiserweight division to this day, it was then. He may not have felt that way. And here's, and this isn't really specific to Chris, although it is to a degree, because it was an issue later on with Chris, as it was with a lot of guys. When I first created that cruiserweight division, when I first sat down with Benoit and Malenko and Guerrero and brought in, Chris Jericho and talked about the division and what my vision was it for, those guys were as excited as they could be, because it was the first really big opportunity they had and the first time that they were ever consistently on a major television platform where they could get themselves over. That's a fact. Nobody can go back and deny it, twist it, or turn it. They were excited about that. And they were thrilled to death to be able to go out there and have the kind of matches that I allowed them to have to showcase their athleticism and their abilities. And that cruiserweight division got over, and it's still over to this day. When I go to autograph signings or when I'm out, in and amongst wrestling fans, naturally they want to talk about the NWO and a couple other things that are obvious, but almost always, if I'm talking to them for 5 or 10 minutes, it comes back to that cruiserweight division. And that cruiserweight division is what allowed Chris Jericho to get over. We built that division. We built it in a way that to this day, the WWE can't figure out how to create that much excitement for that division as I did and we did as a team. It's never been done before, and it's probably never going to be done again. So to hear Chris, who got really his opportunity to move on and to springboard into WWE as a result of that, and have that kind of a bad taste in his mouth about it, is, I got to be honest, I'm disappointed. He feels the way he feels, or maybe he just wrote what he felt he needed to write to make the book interesting. I don't know. But I don't regret how I built a cruiserweight division. Could I have done better? Sure. Absolutely. I'm sure I could have, especially with 20/20 hindsight. But I just don't know of anybody that I talk to that looks back at that cruiserweight division at that time and goes, oh, man, that sucked. Do you?
No, I loved it. It was what made WCW so much fun for me. Let's talk about Super Brawl 7. It goes down February 23rd in San Francisco. It's the next big pay-per-view for Jericho after Sold Out. He's working with Eddie Guerrero here for the U.S. title. Eddie gets the win in 12 minutes and 2 seconds, and Meltzer liked the match, giving it 3.25 stars, but he wrote, "The fans live treated this match like an intermission. People were leaving once it got started, chanting boring, even though they were doing great moves and generally not paying attention, which killed what could have been the best match on the show." This sort of feels like a bit of a theme here in Jericho's early run where the fans just aren't into it. Do you think it's the babyface character? I mean, it's certainly not the action. Or at this point, is the NWO just so fucking hot it dwarfs everything else?
I think it's a combination of the two. Looking back at it now, and especially the way you're laying it out here and just trying to visualize what was going on, at that time overall. I think it was two things. I think... And maybe one of the ways I could have made the cruiserweight division and some of the matches that Chris is referring to now mean more is if I didn't rely so much on the pure athleticism of them and built in more of a story than I did. We had story. There was reasons for it. There were promos that, supported these matches and videos and all kinds. It's not like we just threw the shit up against the wall and hope it stuck. I'm not suggesting that was the case, but we didn't have as much depth of story as we did in the NWO because that was the focus of the company at that time. So I think it's fair to say that the audience probably didn't react. Not fair. It's probably accurate to say they didn't react the way a performer like Chris would want them to perform given what they were doing, which was exceptional. And it would be disappointing, and I understand that. And it was probably because there just wasn't quite enough story there. And that was, again, not to be redundant, but I wasn't relying on story for the cruiserweights. It's probably a little bit like some of the stuff that we see today, 20 some odd years later, which is really just about the athleticism and not so much about the characters in the story. It happens to be the hottest shit going right now, but it was probably a little bit of that back then too, and the audience just wasn't quite into it, especially compared to massive success, especially at that time, that we had in the NWL. That's really all they wanted to see. And I don't think if you go back and look, and while, now especially, fans, again, autograph signings, whatever, Comic-Cons, wherever you go, where there's wrestling fans, and they look back now at the Cruiserweight division, and sure, now they look back and like, oh, wow, that was the greatest thing at that time. But at that time, only a smaller percentage of the audience really dug it. It took a while for the legacy, I guess, if you will, or legacy is the only word I can think of the Cruiserweight division, before people finally realized just how good it was. But in the moment, it didn't get the kind of crowd reactions that some of the other stuff got.
Well, let's talk about, what he's doing on TV the rest of the time. We did sort of gloss over that. He's getting wins over Craig Pittman, Alex Wright, even Jeff Jarrett. And he has matches on Nitro with Steve Regal, picks up a win there. Scotty Riggs, Malenko beats him to retain the U.S. title. He loses to Ming, and then he's off for a couple of weeks to New Japan, and he does the Super Juniors tournament. So there's the sort of return that you had sort of alluded to. He comes back on June 9th, and he loses to Alex Wright. And then Ultimo Dragon beats him. He finally gets a win back on Alex Wright on June 23rd. I want to mention this show because this is something you guys were sort of trying here. June 28th, it's Inglewood, California. Six would beat Rey Mysterio to retain the Cruiserweight title, and Jericho essentially challenged the winner beforehand, and he comes down and pins Six in just 32 seconds. And Meltzer would write at the time that Chris was booed out of the building. And it has been something that you guys were sort of trying at the time, where you're doing these super shows in major markets, and you even flirted with the idea and eventually did put the audio for shows like this on essentially internet pay-per-view. Back in the original days of podcasting, you might say, they weren't streaming it from a video standpoint, but they were the audio. How does all of that come together? And what do you remember about this non-televised title change here in Los Angeles?
God, thanks for asking the question that I just can't really fill in the blanks on.
Sure.
I don't remember much of it, bro. I just don't.
There's your second bro of the day. Do you want to punch yourself?
Damn it! Damn it! God! Oh,
that's so fun. He's the Cruiserweight champion now, just as promised here. He gets a quick win, and people aren't really excited about it in the building, but he does have good matches afterwards. I know it's not popular, but I was a super fan of Jericho by this point. His matches were outstanding. The babyface stuff still kind of sucks, but once the bell rings, you're in for a treat. He gets a win over Juventud Guerrera and Ultimo Dragon. I mean, lots of fun stuff that you guys are putting together for him here. The match with Ultimo Dragon is one of the more underrated ones. It's Bash at the Beach, 1997. I've always been a bit of an Ultimo Dragon mark. I can't recommend this enough. If you're looking for something fun to watch this week, go watch Bash at the Beach 97 and just find this Ultimo Dragon Chris Jericho match. They go nearly 13 minutes. Jericho's going to retain. Meltzer fucking loved it. 4.25 stars. Maybe his highest rated match of the year at that point. What'd you think of the pairing of Ultimo Dragon and Chris Jericho? Why did it work? We haven't talked about Ultimo Dragon here on the show very much.
I loved Ultimo Dragon. Sonny Ono was instrumental in bringing him in, and still works with him to this day. Ultimo was working in Mexico quite a bit. He was working in Japan. Just one of the most, God, he was easy to work with, professional, and amazing athlete in the ring. And I really saw, in my mind at least, I saw a tremendous upside with him, because again, he brought that Japanese mystique and that diversity to the roster, and he could go. And he was so easy to work with. Just, God, I don't think I've ever worked with more of a gentleman when it comes to talent. I mean, he was just amazing to work with and amazing to watch in the ring.
How was his English? I'm not asking that to be funny. You said he was an amazing talent to work with and, such a gentleman. What was the communication like with him?
I didn't have any trouble. His English was pretty good. I mean, we couldn't sit down and discuss, the theory of evolution.
Right.
But, when it came to, laying out a match or talking about a story or, scheduling something in the future or going out and having dinner. I saw him, God, when did I see him? About a year ago, I had dinner with him. And I had no trouble communicating with him.
Not too long after this, a couple of weeks, in fact, Jericho loses the Cruiserweight title to Alex Wright. At this point, what was the strategy behind who's champion of the Cruiserweight title? Is there any sort of long-term plan, or is it very much, hey, they won't see this coming? I mean, are you guys trying to sort of hang your hat on the guy as here's who we're building the division around? Or what's the rhyme or reason by which the listen to me, the Cruiserweight title changes hands?
Yeah, I can't go back and try to rationalize a strategy or even recall a strategy. Again, I'd have to look at in context everything we were doing at that time. We're talking about one single match and one moment and a title change. It's just hard to put it to the right perspective. I would say generally, if someone put a gun to my head and said, answer the fucking question, or I'm going to pull the trigger, I would say the general rule was we were trying to do the unexpected. One of the things that was core to the success of Nitro from the very beginning was to do the unexpected, to surprise the audience and to be as unpredictable as possible. So if I had to guess, I would imagine that was probably at the core of that decision. But A, I'm not sure I made it, and B, whoever did make it, I'm not sure if that was really it or not. Alex was a guy, it's easy to make fun of Alex right now, but Alex was a guy that Dusty Rhodes was high on. Alex was a guy that your future father-in-law was extremely high on. These are guys that were booking before me, before I had any influence in booking. I didn't even want to go near the room. They were high on Alex Wright. Now, it's easy to look back now, 20 years later, and go, what the hell were you thinking? But in that moment, Alex was not a guy that, people looked at and went, oh, my God, what a clown. He may have been put, in silly positions that wasn't his choice or decision in terms of the way we had him go out there and, perform like a dick dancer. But that wasn't him. He was a hell of an athlete with a great look, and if you ever talk to Rick about, Alex, when Alex first came in, and while Rick was booking, they were very high on Alex. So again, context. Yeah, maybe looking back at it now, and I'm sure perhaps when Chris was writing his book, he may have felt like, wasn't really doing much for him. But at the time, there were a lot of people that were high on Alex.
There's lots of rumor and innuendo around Alex Wright, and that perhaps someone who had a little bit of power in the company essentially had a crush on him. And that's the reason he was booked and got this position.
Oh my boy.
Thank you. Let's talk about that, because as silly as it sounds, it is sort of the thing that we hear a lot, that Jim Barnett was, for lack of a better word, sweet on Alex Wright. And I don't know, can you speak to that at all?
I don't think I was really involved in bringing that was pretty early, right?
Right.
It had to be 92, 93.
No, it wasn't quite that early, but he was signed when you were there, but it's still probably someone that would have maybe flown under your radar a little bit. From my understanding.
Yeah, but I don't think I signed him. That's my point.
He came in 94.
I still don't think I signed him. That might have been a Dusty decision. It might have been somebody working with Dusty. It was Dusty. Who was booking? It was Dusty, Kevin, and Jim Ross were kind of the guys that were writing TV at the time and were dealing with talent. I didn't really control that entire process. I may have in 94. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'd have to go back and really dig into that, because to me, just talking about it now, it seemed like Alex was there before I had a lot of control. Maybe I was the executive producer back then, which means I had a lot of control over television and where we shot it,
right,
how we shot it. But I didn't really get too heavily involved, or I should say singularly in control of the talent side of things until late 94, maybe 95. When Bob Dew left, whenever that is, Google it. When Bob Dew left is when I basically took over control of everything. Up until that point, I had everything to do with the television side, but I had nothing to do with the live events and the talent side. When I first became executive producer, Ole Anderson had control of that. He and Bob Dew. That was not part of my budget.
Yeah, I mean, you're promoted from executive producer to executive vice president in 94. So that makes sense. It is sort of interesting that, well, we'll talk about that another time. Let's talk about the match. Let's talk about Road Wild 1997. Alex Wright gets a pinfall win here, over Chris Jericho, 13 minutes and 3 seconds. I can't wait for us to talk about, Road Wild in the future. Let's just keep rolling for now. Alex Wright is, working with him a lot on the loops, and he even drops the title back to Chris on a Saturday night taping. So they're sort of bouncing the title around a little bit. Let's get to August 21st. It's Clash of the Champions 35. And how about this one? Jericho and Guerrero working together, and Jericho gets a pinfall win, which is pretty outstanding for Jericho's career here, because Guerrero has been positioned as a United States champion very recently. They get 3.25 stars. It sort of feels like you guys are trying to figure out who Chris Jericho is, what to do with him, how to sort of push him. You're not really sure what you've got. Ultimately, is the decision made to give him a win here on a big show like Clash of the Champions as sort of a vote of confidence?
I don't think it was a vote of confidence. I'll tell you from my perspective, and looking at the timeline now in hindsight, it kind of goes back to where we started in this conversation. My vision and mine, Kevin Sullivan might have had his own, or Terry Taylor, or any number of other people that had some influence creatively, because everybody did, just like everybody does right now in WWE. It's a little bit of a different situation, obviously, but my vision was Chris, Dean, Eddie, and Chris as the core, along with the sporadic and intermittent integration of the luchadors and our crew from Japan when we could bring them in. But I saw Chris the day I hired him as one of those, core four, if you want to call it that. And this probably is a manifestation of that. I'm not saying that was the plan. I'm not trying to make myself sound smart. But when you sit back and you listen to this show and you listen to the timeline of events and you realize that, no, we're not going to just pick a guy up that nobody's really ever seen or heard of before, and we're not really sure what we've got with him. We hear a lot of great things about him, so we're just going to throw him right in the mix and make him, the Cruiserweight champion. That's not what we did with anybody, quite honestly, that I can recall. I'm sure you and Dave Meltzer can correct me on that at some point. But for the most part, it was bring him in, expose him, try to familiarize the audience with him, and when the storyline is right and the time is right, put them where you hope they're going to be successful. And as you've just laid this whole thing out, that kind of sounds like what was done, whether it was Kevin Sullivan's, architecture, or mine, or a combination of the two. Or maybe it was Chris and Eddie and Dean, for all I know. It was, and ideas and a plan, generally didn't begin and end with one person.
Well, you finally got
unless they're really successful. And of course, if they're really successful, everybody takes credit for it. But if it shits the bed, that's an orphan.
The match you had dreamed about, September 9th, 1997. It finally happens. Chris beats Brad Armstrong by DQ to retain the title. Chris is,
you got to build up to a match like that. You can't just throw that thing out there. Like I just said, you've got a second or third generation wrestler in Brad Armstrong, who everybody regarded as one of the best technicians in the planet. He was a great looking guy. Chris, of course, looked like he walked right off the cover of GQ magazine. And in my mind, what I saw was not only a match that was a thing of beauty in the ring, it was a thing of beauty on the poster. It was awesome.
I love you for that. Chris is pretty unhappy with WCW around this time, and he even wrote in his book, even though I'd been working in WCW for over a year, I'd never signed my contract. I wasn't holding out for more money or having any sort of legal disagreement. I just simply never put the pen to paper and returned the contract to WCW's lawyers. Nobody seemed to realize it, and I decided to see how long I could go without signing. It was astonishing to me that no one in the office had ever followed up with me about it, but this was also the same company that sent me a FedEx with nothing inside. So it wasn't exactly hard to believe. As a free agent, I made a call to my friend Don Callis. He was working in the WWF as the Jackal and had the ear of the head booker, Vince Russo. I asked Don to ask Russo if he would ever be interested in hiring me, and he said, quote, Russo said, whenever you want to come to the WWF, just say the word. And a few days later, that's what he hears. And he decides, you know what? Let's see what we can do. And it is sort of interesting that WCW had essentially not really paid attention to the contract and allowed this conversation to even happen. Of course, we know he doesn't wind up signing, and he does eventually sign with you, but this contract sort of flying under the radar. I mean, obviously that's not your responsibility, but it was somebody's. I mean, this guy at the time has a fucking title for you guys, and he's not under contract in the middle of the Monday Night War. Who's to blame for that sort of oversight?
One of two people. The buck would have to stop with Nick Lambros, but it would probably really be Diana Myers. Diana Myers was horrible. She was just horrible. And I don't even want to go into it. There was a lot of issues there on the legal side of things. That was not, as you point out, it's not my control. I didn't have a tickle list of all the contracts that were coming due and what had been signed and wasn't signed. That was one of the negatives about Turner Broadcasting. The way it was structured is finance was kind of off my limits, so to speak, with the exception of staying within budget and, you know, the things that, from an operational point of view, that we had to be aware of on a day-to-day basis. But when it came to legal, especially, that was just, you know, we talk about things, I would approve things, and it would disappear up into Turner Legal in the North Tower. And it was a little bit of a vacuum from that point forward. So I can see how it happened. I really can.
What kept Jericho from really pursuing this with Russo any further was the understanding that really you had taken a chance on him, and he appreciated that, and that you'd always been more than fair with him, especially when you talk about the money part. And he felt like backing out and sort of leaving and taking advantage of this contract situation would have made him a real shit house. Those are his words. So in the end, you know, he sticks around, and he sticks around for Fall Brawl, which goes down on September 14th. And Eddie Guerrero beats him for the Cruiserweight title here in 17 minutes and 19 seconds, 3 3/4 stars. What did Eddie and Chris have that was so special? I mean, it feels like every time they had a match, it was a good match. Is it just a similar style, an inherent trust between them, just their relationship? What made those matches click in your opinion? All
of the above. And I think it has to start with trust. I'm not a wrestler, never really done it. The things that I've done in the ring have nothing to do with being a wrestler. But being around it and spending time and getting to know the people like your future father-in-law, Ric Flair, and Steve Austin, and other people who I have a lot of respect for, first of all, your styles have to mesh. They do. It's chemistry, just like you and Bruce, or you and Tony. It's chemistry. And part of that chemistry is trust. And I think that was especially true, and respect. And that was especially true with Jericho, Benoit, Malenko, and Eddie. They were very, very unique individuals who had the same vision in the ring,
right?
Who understood who all agreed on the psychology, and they were all very generous with each other because of the respect and the trust. And I think that in a large nutshell is what made all of them, not just Jericho, all of them so special.
I'm sort of curious about the relationship you had with MGM Grand. Let's talk about Halloween Havoc, because you guys run Halloween Havoc many years in a row here at MGM Grand. And Tony has sort of freestyled on what happened when, that Halloween Havoc was really like the WCW Super Show. Although a lot of people regard it as Starrcade, he thinks that internally the company really hung their hat on Halloween Havoc, even during this era. And you guys are doing tremendous business here. For instance, in 97, it's a $297,000 gate, $102,000 in merchandise. It's an all-time record for WCW, but it was a place that, you know, not a lot of major shows were happening. Of course, famously WrestleMania 9 happened there, but outside of that, it really becomes more of a WCW town in this era, especially the casino aspect that you guys were doing with MGM Grand. How did that relationship come to be, or is that something you would have been involved with?
No, I advocated, you know, it was a Zane Bresloff. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it was a Zane Bresloff push. I do remember, because Zane and I were pretty close by then. Zane was one of the people that I talked to at, 10 o'clock at night about ideas or strategies, not so much creative ideas. They never really got into angles and storylines or who should go over who. That wasn't what Zane was about. Zane was more about the business of the business. And Zane had a lot of relationships in Las Vegas. Zane liked to gamble. Zane spent a lot of time in Las Vegas and had a lot of great contacts in Las Vegas and had promoted there. So it was really Zane. And I remember the first time I went out to Vegas to talk to the management at MGM Grand prior to doing a show there. And Zane was there with me. So that was really a Zane Bresloff idea. And it worked so well from the get-go. And not just because we made a lot of money. I mean, that's part of it, a big part of it. But the idea that we were consistently going back, and it wasn't just being a big show in Las Vegas, it was being a big show at the MGM Grand. It was co-branding ourselves, which is one of the reasons why I think in a lot of people's mind, at least mine, Tony's right about this, when he says internally that was kind of like the big show, even though Starrcade had the legacy, and up until probably 97, 98, Starrcade would be considered, WCW's WrestleMania, because that's how it was conceived and promoted. But in my mind, that Halloween Havoc was the show. And part of it was because we could do such great business there. But the other part of it was in all of our promotions and all of our marketing, we're coming to you from the Garden Arena inside of the MGM Grand Casino, just like big promotions, rock concerts, UFC, and everybody else has done since that time until this day. That was a big part of it. So it was, in my mind, that was the show of the year.
He works with Guido here. 7 minutes and 18 seconds. Of course, Jericho gets the win. Of course, this is a name that a lot of people are familiar with because he's now the booker of New Japan Pro Wrestling. Jericho gets 3 stars in the Wrestling Observer. What do you remember about this relationship where you're able to feature some Japanese talent on your pay-per-view like this? Why did this make sense? At the time, I guess we should remind everybody, he's working for War, not New Japan. War is a Japanese wrestling promotion, but I guess they have some sort of affiliation with New Japan.
Yeah, they would have. I wouldn't have. There was no way I would have ever used anybody from Japan without, coordinating with my counterparts over there. So yeah, he would have come through New Japan, whatever his deal was. Trust me, the relationships and the politics in Japan were pretty complex. I wouldn't even begin to try to understand them, but I wouldn't have brought him in unless it was through New Japan.
It's sort of funny because Jericho's pretty fired up about this, and he's familiar with Guido because they work together in Japan, and he's excited. So he flies his dad in to see the match, and they're having drinks at the MGM Grand the night before the show. And Terry Taylor approaches him, everybody's favorite, and says, "Hey, they want Guido to go over." And Jericho says it made absolutely no sense. He's a regular employee. Guido's here for like a week. And Terry Taylor allegedly says, "Well, at least you'll be on the show. The boss can take a look at you and see what you can do." And Jericho's sort of floored by this, thinking, like, I've been with the company a whole year. If Eric doesn't know what I can do by now, losing to a quote unquote foreign exchange student certainly wasn't going to help. He says when you showed up at the bar, he couldn't contain himself, and he comes over and sort of even though he's never really complained before, he says to you, he does here. And he says, you're just as surprised as he was. And he says, you said, why are you supposed to lose? Who are we promoting here? I'm going to change that immediately. What do you remember about the finish for this, if anything, being changed in that exchange with Jericho in Vegas?
I don't recall it.
Okay. It is an interesting match because Jericho nearly breaks his fucking neck in this fucking match. If you want to go out of your way to see it, let's talk about the next night. Eddie Guerrero pins Chris Jericho, but we start really cooking with gas on November 3rd. Chris pins Scott Hall. And this is an interesting decision at the time, especially since we talked about what we did so early in his WCW run. And allegedly, Chris is sort of the catalyst here. He goes to Kevin Sullivan and begs to put him in a few matches with quote unquote big names to give him some credibility. And he says Sullivan responded by booking him with Scott Hall, but it was supposed to be a 5-minute squash loss on Nitro. But Hall decides to rebel and instead lets Jericho win. Now he kicks his ass for most of the match, and then Jericho rolls him up with a small cradle or a small package. And it's sort of fun to look back in hindsight and hear that, wait a minute, Scott was supposed to go over, but he let Jericho win. What do you remember about this? How fucking fired up are you that these guys are going off script? I don't guess it's necessarily Jericho's fault, but Scott Hall clearly trying to stir shit up here. November 97. What do you remember?
I don't remember that match. I mean, I just don't. 21 years ago.
Sure.
But I do know that as you lay that out to me, that's kind of consistent with Scott. And I can see Scott going to Kevin Sullivan, who was the booker at that time, and convincing Kevin either by wearing him down or just convincing him that that was a good idea. And Kevin coming to me and saying, look, this is what we're going to do. Here's why we're going to do it. And I can see myself going, okay, if it makes sense, that's what you want to do, we'll do it. I'm not putting it off on Kevin because I don't remember the match. I don't remember that conversation. But as you lay it out to me, does that sound like something Scott would do to prove a point? And in his own way, you know, using his psychology, get himself over and maybe bury Chris just a little bit in the process? I could see it. I could see it.
Jericho goes and does an interview with OneWrestling.com, which back in the day was a lot like today's Pro Wrestling Insider. And in the promo that he does with One Wrestling, because that's really what he's doing, he challenges WCW to give him a chance and guarantees success if they do. And he says something like he'd noticed that Hall and Nash, whenever they would complain about something, which was often, they usually got their way. So he was just following their lead, and that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak. And Terry Taylor comes to him and says he read the interview on the website, and he says, you've done the right thing. Quote, Eric knows about it, and you should ask him for your release. I think you'd be surprised with his answer. And Jericho, of course, freestyles, I didn't really need a release. I don't have a contract. And he says that when he meets with you, you sort of cut to the chase and you said, I read your little interview and I think you're right in a lot of ways. You're spinning your wheels and you're doing nothing. The problem is I can't do anything more with you right now because you don't have familiarity with the fans that the top guys with years of TV exposure do. And, you know, he sort of pushes back a little bit. And eventually you say, I think you have talent and I don't want to lose you. So just be patient. And he sort of freestyles that patience wasn't really one of his strong suits, but he feels like this meeting sort of got his point across and he was satisfied and settled. Do you remember this?
Yes, I do remember it. Not word for word, but I think, you know, Chris's recollection is, if not 100% accurate, real close. I do remember the time in particular, because it didn't just happen overnight. It wasn't just the incident with the OneWrestling.com interview, which was basically, and by the way, Bob Ryder, who worked for us at the time. It wasn't just an isolated or the first incident. There had been conversations that were similar in tone. Chris, as I've said throughout this entire show, Chris always had a very clear idea of who he was and who he wanted to be. and what his potential was, he clearly, even by virtue of, some of the things you've read from his book, which I don't know when his book was written, but, he clearly didn't think much of the Cruiserweight division or the opportunity that provided to him. He saw himself as Bill Goldberg, not Bill the character, but he saw himself in the same light as a Hulk Hogan, as a Bill Goldberg, as a Scott Hall, as a Kevin Nash. He didn't want to be the king of cruiserweights. He wanted to be the king of the ring, and specifically in WWE, not in WCW, as Chris would acknowledge later on. So there were a series of those conversations, and Chris was frustrated, and he did express it to me, and I did ask him to be patient, and I did think the world of him. And I know I'm fast forwarding here. I didn't want to see him go, and I asked him aggressively. I didn't beg him. Might have been close to give me a chance to try to keep him in WCW and not leave, because I didn't want him to leave.
Right.
I knew what an asset he was, but I couldn't get there as quickly as he wanted me to get there.
And he was sort of ready for it here in 97 as well. He gets wins in November over Disco Inferno. Rey Mysterio beats him. He's in the 60-man battle royal for World War III. The Giant wins that. The next night on Nitro, Buff Bagwell beats him. Then Scott Hall beats him. Then Bagwell beats him again on December 22nd. And he writes in his book that his patience is really wearing thin. And he runs into Terry Taylor at a Nitro taping and says, "What's up?" And Terry Taylor says, "Just your career. We're going to turn you heel." And this is sort of the moment that the light bulb switches for Jericho and maybe even WCW, when he finally has an opportunity to turn heel. Would you say that's fair to say, that that's when he really started to shine?
Yeah. And that's what, first of all, that's what he wanted. And not only Chris, by the way, 96, 97, 98 was a very, very tough time to be a babyface for anybody, including Chris.
Let's talk about why that is, because I think that gets glossed over a lot, but Don Callis even mentioned this the other day. The worst thing to be is a fucking cool heel, because if you're a cool heel, all that you do is leave the babyface looking like a silly, goofy motherfucker. And the NWO, although they're heels, they're fucking cool heels. So if you're a babyface, you sort of look pretty lame. Isn't that fair to say?
Well, let's pick up the phone and call Don Callis and ask him, how did Bill Goldberg deal with that? How did Sting and his Crow character deal with that? It's possible. It's not easy.
Right.
And I'm sure Don Callis, with all of his expertise, as we're seeing manifest itself over in Impact Wrestling or whatever it's called right now, I'm sure we're seeing a lot of, a much better approach to psychology. But let's go back at that time, which, by the way, at that time, those really cool heels that Don Callis, thinks is such a dumbass idea, were printing money and turn the business around, just like DX did for WWE.
Eric, I think you're getting fired up about the same thing. You just said it was really hard to be a babyface.
No,
and
but
that's sort of what Callis
there's
was
a
saying.
difference between acknowledging that it was hard and burying the idea.
Well, no, he didn't.
Of course it was fucking hard. Of course it was hard.
He didn't bury the NWO at all. He was referencing today's product, that if you're a heel, be a fucking heel, because you're not really doing the babyface any favors in the process. He didn't say anything critical of the NWO or your booking at all. I mean, you can continue to shit on him if you'd like to, but he wasn't you here at all.
If we're burying cool heels, because that's what I heard you say,
right?
That's what the NWO was. And the context that we're talking about is Chris Jericho and the NWO. So forgive me for getting a little confused, but when we're talking about that period of time, 96, 97, 98, when we're talking about the NWO in particular and Chris's frustration with being a babyface, and by reference being the cool heels, which was the NWO at that time, and later on in 98 DX, and then we introduce Don Callis, who says it's the worst thing you could do is to be a cool heel. It's a little confusing. Now, go back. During that period of time, it was a fucking horrible time to be a babyface, because it was a transition. There was never heels like that before. There were never NWO type heels or DX type heels back then. It had never been done before. So your traditional baby faces, all of your guys that learned, how to wrestle, back in the 60s and the 70s or the 80s or 90s, who learned a formula from guys who learned that formula back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, they had a real difficult time because it completely changed the paradigm of a character. So it doesn't surprise me that Chris early on wanted to be a heel. Nobody wanted. Sting didn't want to be a babyface. Once the NWO started getting hot, nobody wanted to go out there and have a match with the heel NWO because it was like pulling fucking teeth to try to get over as a babyface. A couple guys did, but the majority of them hated it, Chris included. So I'm sure once he got that green light to become a heel, he probably felt not only relieved because he wasn't swimming upstream every single night, but I think creatively and instinctively he was more of a heel than he was a babyface to begin with. Look at him now. I mean, look at the stuff he's doing now. He's more, and now he's got carte blanche.
Right.
He did even in WWE when I was there. No, nobody has carte blanche in WWE except for, maybe The Rock or, Steve Austin at one point or another. But for the most part, when I was in WWE, while Chris was there, I watched all the rest of the talent, in the locker room, get their scripts and go back and just figure out how they're going to do it. And then I'd look over in the corner and there's Chris Jericho with Brian Gewirtz changing shit. I mean, that's just Chris.
Let's talk about the decision to turn him heel here and the way it's done. The plan is to go on a losing streak, which he was essentially already on. But now after each loss, he's going to snap and do like a temper tantrum. And Terry is pretty specific in his direction to Jericho here. Don't play it for laughs. Play it seriously, like you just lost control. So he starts pitching fits, smashing chairs against the ring post. He even rips the suit jacket right off Dave Pinzer. He of course buys Pinzer a new jacket, tears it to pieces again, but he's begging the crowd for their forgiveness. And he's trying to sort of play like he's still a baby face. He's just had a slip up here. And it really starts to give him some credibility. What do you remember? I mean, how brilliant was this? This is an excellent way to sort of turn a guy heel. And I don't know that anybody's done it better than Jericho did here in late 97.
I don't either. And that's really Jericho. That wasn't Terry Taylor. It wasn't Eric Bischoff. It wasn't Kevin Sullivan. That's why Chris is who Chris is today, because he got a little bit of rope. He got a little bit of opportunity and he made it really work for himself. And some of the, when I look back at some of them, just not the biggest moments and, things that changed the world and all that kind of stuff. But if somebody says right now, what do you think some of the most entertaining, all around entertaining content that you produced at WCW in the 90s? And it would be, Chris Jericho would be right at the top of the list because he was a heel, but his character was so good and he executed it so well. And he had his own creative. Like I said, nobody sat down, Terry Taylor, me, or anybody else sat down and said, okay, beat by beat, like someone would in WWE today. Beat by beat, here's what we want you to do. Here's what we want you to say. They would hand him like an Etch-a-Sketch. Say, okay, I played in the back. Here's my Etch-a-Sketch version of what I want you to do. Go fill in the blanks. And then Chris would go fill in the blanks. And the shit that he did was amazing. From Ralphus to his goofy ass hair that he ended up coming to the ring with and his whole persona. I mean, he just did such an amazing job.
And he's doing an amazing job here at Sold Out 98. He's working with Rey Mysterio and he wins the Cruiserweight title from Rey here. But this is the last match before Mysterio has knee surgery. So after the match, that's really the story. Of course, he gets the tap out win here with the Lion Tamer. But after the match, Jericho destroys Mysterio's knee, takes the brace off, starts hitting him with the brace, puts it on the ring steps, smashing it with the TV box. And then Mysterio is carried out of the ring. And he's, of course, going to have reconstructive surgery on the knee. 3.25 stars. Man, the heel turn is in full effect. And this is great stuff. He's even modifying his look here. He's growing long sideburns and trying to get like a Gene Simmons poodle top knot in the top of his hair. He's wearing a white leather vest that's airbrushed with a big picture of himself. And he's wearing like elbow length gloves, and he's just walking in the most arrogant, sort of ridiculous way ever. And it's getting over in a big way. As you're seeing this sort of manifest itself week after week, do you realize what a good decision this was? What's the feedback you're giving him? It feels like everybody knew right away, we've got fucking gold with this.
Oh, how could we not? I mean, yes, and more. Yes. Everybody saw it. I mean, he was forcing his way to the top of everybody's radar. I mean, he wasn't going to be denied, and you couldn't deny it. The crowd was having a blast. The boys were laughing their asses off. People were wanting to work with him. That's when you know you're getting over. So yeah, there was nobody that I can recall ever going, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea.
He goes on a win streak, man. He's beating everybody here, whether it's Malenko, Guerrero, Chavo, whoever. Super Brawl 8, he gets a win there over Juventud. And Meltzer would say this is easily the best match on the show. He gives it 3 3/4 stars. It is sort of a match that maybe gets glossed over, but I can't wait to take you to task on this someday. We'll briefly touch on it here though, and then circle back because this is a Jericho show. This is the match where Juventud has to unmask, and it was a heavily debated topic. You know, I know we're going to do a full episode on this sometime. Give us a taste of why you fucking wanted to unmask Juventud Guerrero.
There's not a single reason. There's a couple reasons. Number one, the lucha culture and awareness in the United States to the 92.5 million households that I was catering to and marketing to didn't really get the whole history and legacy of the masks. So while I understood it in Mexico, and it did bring an interesting dynamic initially into WCW and on Nitro, there's also a reality as a television producer, and it's something that I know is beat into the heads of WWE talent to this day, is you sell your character and you sell your match with your eyes. And if the audience can't see your face and they can't see your eyes, or you don't register in order for the cameras to pick it up, it's why you'll never watch a WWE match and see somebody selling with their head down. They always sell with their head up, and you always see the pain or the joy or the frustration very evidently in their face. Kevin Dunn and his team do a great job of getting those shots. And I was trying to accomplish that same thing because I felt at that point that I had done everything that I could really do with the luchadors, the masked ones in particular. Well, they're all unmasked, but I had done everything that I could do with them. And in order for me to try to take it to another level and step it up and make their characters even more important, that I had to have the ability to sell and create emotion with their looks, the same way everybody else was doing it. I didn't have a strong licensing and merchandising opportunity for the masks like the WWE did, 8 or 10 years later with Rey Mysterio. But so for me, what was I giving up? I was giving up a licensing and merchandising opportunity that for the most part didn't really exist. And what was I possibly going to get? I was possibly going to get a way to better utilize that talent by being able to tell a better story with them, because their faces would help me tell that story that I couldn't necessarily get in an interview all the time. And I certainly couldn't get when they had a mask on.
It's a heavily debated topic. I can't wait to, I'm going to spare the beating for now because this is something I've wanted to talk about for a long time, but I don't want to get sidetracked. Let's keep going here and talk about something that Meltzer wrote, because I know that'll get your ass fired up. In the March 16th Observer, he writes, Benoit, Jericho, and Dean Malenko all quote unquote bumped into Vince McMahon, Shawn Michaels, and Steve Austin and others on March 3rd at the hotel near the Pittsburgh airport. Steiner's, Kurt Hennig, and some others were there as well. The WWF had been running Wheeling, West Virginia, and WCW was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And so they all have this sort of bump into meeting. Is there any sort of concern when you hear about this? Because allegedly, Guerrero tries to get a release and you threaten to tie him up legally, and it's a bit of a sore point. And I guess this whole accidental bumping into meeting that's written about here is what gets all this circulated. Do you recall this at all?
I do not. And I wouldn't have been concerned. That would have been, especially during that was a very litigious era between WWE and WCW. I find it hard to, I'm not saying it didn't happen or I don't believe it happened, but I find it difficult to believe that Vince or anybody else would have suggested in any way, shape, or form at that particular time when both companies were under a high degree of scrutiny from a legal perspective to tortiously interfere, because any suggestion that Eddie Guerrero tried to get out of his contract to come to WWE would be tantamount to tortious interference, which is a pretty, it's an ominous charge in a court of law, because there's damages that extend way beyond just immediate damages. And I don't think Vince would have done it. It could have happened. There was a lot of frustration with a lot of guys at that time. Maybe, Eddie was a hothead. Eddie and I would get into it often. Wouldn't have surprised me, but I would not have been concerned about anybody jumping or leaving. And I would have tied him up in court.
Of course.
I would have wrapped him up in chains and thrown him in a river.
I love you for that. March is uncensored month, and it goes down in Mobile here in 98. Jericho retains the Cruiserweight title, beating Dean Malenko in 14 minutes and 42 seconds. After the match, which Meltzer wrote had a great finish, and he gives it 3.5 stars. Gene Okerlund comes to the ring and blows off Jericho, and then starts browbeating Malenko. This is directly from the Observer. Something fierce, telling him he'd lost on 4 pay-per-views in a row, that he was a loser, and he was supposed to win this match and blow it again. It looked like Okerlund was turning heel, while the normally emotionless Malenko acted like he was about to cry. Malenko never said a word while Okerlund was ripping on him until he finally said he was going home and walked out. 3.5 stars. What do you think of the creative here?
I don't know where we were going with that, so it's hard for me to comment on that. Gene would not have taken that direction unless he was given that direction.
Sure.
So clearly there was a story or an arc or an angle that was being developed there. I don't recall what it was.
Well, you're going to have Jericho go on TV and start calling him Stinko Malenko and say he's now working the grill at Harry's Burgers in Tampa.
There you go.
Yeah. So that's the deal. But you sort of are positioning the guy, and just outright having one of your babyface announcers fucking call the guy a loser. It is a little uncharacteristic of traditional wrestling thinking. God,
imagine that. Disrupting the paradigm.
The spring break edition of Nitro goes down on March 16th this year, and it's a pretty fun deal. Juvy is working with Chris here, and before the match, Jericho's doing a promo where he's talking about all the trophies he's won recently. Mysterio's knee, Juvy's mask, Dean's dignity. And Meltzer would comment, Chris is carrying himself like a superstar. Is this fair to say by March of 98, just about 3 months into the sort of heel turn run here, he's already a made guy?
I think it's fair. And here's what else is happening there. As you lay that out to me, and I'm, visualizing it now in my head, because some of the stuff I just haven't thought about in, 21 years. But as you lay that scenario out kind of beat by beat, what's happening right there was that we're now integrating story and characters in a much bigger way into that cruiserweight division.
Yep.
And clearly Chris is emerging, as the leader in that group, because he just had more charisma. He may not have been as gifted as Chris Benoit, technically. Maybe close. Maybe some people think he was better. I don't know. I don't. But he was close. He was certainly, all of them were in that category. but Chris clearly had the most charisma and the ability and dimension to his character to be able to carry something like that. But again, going from the period that you're talking about now, which is March of 98, going back to 24 months earlier, when there really wasn't any story and there wasn't any character in the cruiserweight division, and it really was all about the athleticism and the presentation in a more traditional wrestling formula, or at least perhaps not a traditional wrestling formula, but maybe more of a traditional Japanese wrestling formula, because that really was the style in Japan at that time. It's one of the things that I was trying to import into WCW. By this time, clearly we had morphed into something that was more showbiz.
It's sort of, to me, this next segment we're going to talk about is maybe the most memorable thing that Jericho did in WCW, at least to me. And there's a lot of fun moments, but March 30th, 1998 is a big one. He beats Marty Jannetty in only 1 minute and 22 seconds, but that's not the story. After the match, Chris gets on the mic and says, Malenko was a man of 1,000 holds, but he's better. He's the man of 1,004 holds. And almost every other, he has this giant, like, rack of paper, the old school computer paper that sort of had the little holes on the side. I know somebody. It's
kind of like the list, right?
It's tremendous. It's the original List of Jericho. And he's running through all the different moves, like, arm bar, and then a Saskatchewan spinning nerve hold, arm bar, shooting star staple press, arm bar, right-handed punch, arm bar. They go to commercial. They come back. He's still reading the fucking list. This is one of my favorite moments in Nitro history. March 30th, 1998, if you'd like to go relive it. Who wrote that? Whose idea was that?
I remember discussing it with Chris. I don't know that I was involved in it creatively or if I just approved it, but I remember loving it because, again, it was different. And I love the idea that it bridged a commercial break.
Right.
Because it was so different, and just was completely opposite of what everybody else was doing at the time. And I thought it was funny as hell. So I remembered being involved in it, but I can't, I could be like everybody else and take credit for it, but I don't think that would be fair. I think it was probably more than anybody. It was Chris, and Chris laying it out and everybody going, fuck, that's awesome.
The hits keep coming, man. The next week he beats Juventud to retain. And before the match, he dedicated Nitro to Dean Malenko and questioned why Prince Iaukea was going to get a shot at the title, calling him Prince Nakaranki. And he's going to have a great time just mispronouncing everybody's name. Just fucking classic stuff here. He does have this match with Prince Iaukea. And before he does the match with Iaukea, they do a deal where he's trying to prove that Prince Iaukea actually weighs more than 225 pounds, which is the weight limit. And there's not some sort of official weigh-in or anything, but Jericho says he's got JJ Dillon's permission to do this. So he brings Iaukea out and has him step on the scale. And Tony Schiavone tells us that Iaukea weighs 218 pounds. Of course, you know what's coming. He picks up the scale and hits Iaukea over the head with it. Fucking great stuff, man. I feel like we're saying that a lot, but this 1998 is probably the most important year of Jericho's career. And I know a lot of people are going to say, no, it was 2001 when he beat Rock and Austin the same night. But to me, this is it, dude. This is the thing that put him on the map. 1998.
He would not have beat Austin and Rock in the same night had it not been for this period of time.
Sure. I totally agree. Spring Stampede, 1998. Good stuff here. He's going to beat Prince Iaukea at 9 minutes and 55 seconds. The fans sort of look at it like a popcorn match, or at least that's what Meltzer would write. He says they didn't do a good job with it, but it's not their fault that the fans weren't into it. The match itself is pretty good. 3.25 stars. They just weren't into it. And I don't think at this point it's that they're not into Jericho. They just probably weren't bought into Prince Iaukea. I don't know when we'll talk about him again. Who was an advocate for Prince Iaukea being in a featured spot like this?
Kevin liked him a lot, and Prince was a good worker. He had a lot of potential. He just didn't have any charisma. And it's not his fault. It's like being born with a great voice. You can improve upon it, but you've got to be born with it. And he had a lot of the he had a lot of good attributes, but charisma wasn't one of them. And I think he was put in a horrible position.
Sort of a fun deal here. The very next night, we've got Chris beating Juventud to retain the title, and he puts him in the Lion Tamer, but Juvy refuses to tap out. So he winds up passing out from the pain, and the referee stops the match. Jericho has a hilarious reaction. He looks down and starts crying and screaming, "Oh my God, I killed Juvy." He beats Psychosis the next week, and they set up a big angle on May 4th where Jericho comes out with a framed picture of Dean Malenko, and he's dedicating the match to him. Just hilarious stuff, riffing on his name. And that sets up Slamboree 98, one of the more memorable angles on pay-per-view. This is the show that we just recently talked about that had Eric Bischoff challenge Vince McMahon to a fight. But here we've got a Cruiserweight battle royal, and the gimmick is the winner gets a shot that night against Jericho for the Cruiserweight title. And Chris comes out first and does the introductions for each of the wrestlers, and they're all just ridiculous. He describes El Dandy as a winner of a Lou Ferrigno lookalike contest. He says Juventud is the ugliest man in the sport. He says Chavo Guerrero is the scourge of the Guerrero family. He says Damien is he can't afford a mask, so he uses paint. There's lots of people who say, just hilarious. We're gonna say this guy is a maitre d', and that guy can get you a great deal on some hubcaps. You know the story here. It's hilarious stuff. If you've never seen it, go back and find it. Slamboree 98. Here's the fun part though. Ciclope is in the match, and it comes down to Ciclope and Juventud Guerrera. They have a conversation though. They're not wrestling. They're just talking. And then Guerrera jumps out of the ring and just eliminates himself. So of course that brings Jericho in, because that means Ciclope has won the match. They start wrestling, and you know what's coming. It's Dean Malenko. He takes the mask off, and Dean Malenko has found a way back in and gets the Texas Cloverleaf for the tap out, 3 1/4 stars. One of the more memorable angles of Jericho's run here in 98. I just love the setup, the whole list of the man of 1,004 holds, the picture, the dedicating, calling him Stinko Malenko, the whole deal. And now the payoff here with the reveal with the mask. Genius. Who can we give credit to?
Chris.
Fucking A, man. Dude was ahead of his time.
He was. He still is. He still is. Once he kind of proved himself, and he did early, and he was persistent. As I said, when we first started this, he had a clear vision of who he is or who he wanted to be and what he had the potential to be. And he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And once he got the green light to go, he took that opportunity and he fucking ran with it. And once it started working the way it was working, I'm pretty sure that 99% of everything that you just laid out came out of Chris's head. He brought it to me, brought it to Terry, brought it to Kevin, brought it to all of us, ran through it, walked through it, and everybody went, go do it. It was awesome.
He starts a conspiracy victim run here, showing up with the sign, and then eventually even, trying to call out JJ Dillon, saying that this is unfair. Malenko should not have been in that Cruiserweight battle royal at Slamboree. June 1st is a pretty fun time in the company as well, because we see a video of Jericho in Washington, D.C., and he's saying, I want to meet with all the members of Congress and the president about this conspiracy. Of course, we know it gets turned away. There's no big payoff. He does get a win over Juventud, and he's working with Malenko at a lot of the house shows. But this whole conspiracy theory thing, going to Washington, D.C., is this also Jericho's creative?
I don't remember.
Sure.
I would assume so.
Of course, we know what this is leading to. They're working towards a rematch with Malenko and Jericho, and JJ Dillon is sort of stuck in the middle as the commissioner of WCW. Let's get to Great American Bash, June 14th, 1998. The match finally happens. The title has been stripped, and it's a vacant title here, and Jericho's going to win by DQ. And I don't know exactly what to make of this match, because it does feel like maybe you shouldn't have stripped it. I mean, I get it's a storyline and they're trying to do something fun here, but now there's a DQ finish here. 3 stars though. These guys had good chemistry together. I don't think they ever had a bad match. And it is sort of interesting what the difference a year makes. You look at a year prior to this and he feels sort of shiftless, but he's really working with the same guys he was then. The difference that, you just discussed a minute ago is very much that now there's a story attached to it. Do you remember there being like an aha moment with the way the cruiserweights had been booked? I mean, I know that you sort of defended the Juventud unmasking earlier, and maybe that is another piece of what you're trying to do here. And you're trying to give them something and tell stars and not make it just about the bell to bell in-ring action. But is there like a moment or a conversation or a meeting where you can look back and say, here's where we decided to sort of shift directions, or did it just happen organically?
Nothing ever happens in an aha moment. And if people tell you that it did, they're probably remembering it the way they want to remember it. Things evolved. The one thing I will tell you is that after a couple, from 95, 96, 97, now we're into 98, we'd been doing the cruiserweight thing for quite a while. The novelty, if you will, of that different presentation and that Japanese style and lucha style had kind of worn off. And, it was a relatively small group it was a small talent, pool in that cruiserweight division. Here's another thing that was really critical to that cruiserweight division. And it became problematic, and none of the guys in it will really want to talk about it much. Maybe they will, but one of the things that guys hated about being in the cruiserweight division, once they got used to having television time, and once they got used to getting a check in the mail every 2 weeks, and once they got used to people recognizing them, out on the street, because that all where, at first you go, wow, this is awesome. This is great. 130 grand a year. Oh man, that's an amazing amount of money until you start spending it. And then you'd really like 250,000 a year until you get that. And then you really want 350,000 a year. Nobody's ever satisfied once you get into that kind of that role, if you will. But one of the things that guys didn't like was being called cruiserweights. They didn't like the fact that we were distinguishing them based on their size. It felt to them like they meant less by default. In my mind, it was the opposite because of what they were capable of doing in the ring. But because that group was pretty small, I didn't want 250-pound guys like we've seen in other wrestling organizations. They call it the X division. Well, what does the X division mean? Well, the rules are there are no rules, which is like the most bullshit explanation of a division that I've ever heard in my life. To this day, I've never heard anything quite that fucking stupid in my life. We wanted the cruiserweight division to be separate and apart, to be different than the heavyweight division. But the guys in it didn't dig that. They didn't like it. They didn't want to be limited. And I understand that. So once we had kind of mixed and matched everybody up the way that we could, so that we didn't feel like we've seen that and done that a couple times. Now, 2 years have gone by. That's when really the evolution of the stories made sense. It didn't make sense in the very beginning because nobody knew who those guys were. Those stories, Chris Jericho couldn't have been that character 2 years earlier.
Right.
Because they didn't know him. He didn't have a backstory. He didn't have a relationship with any of the other guys. That story between him and Dean Malenko made sense because we spent 2 years building that relationship. Not necessarily in an angle, but those guys, people recognize them as the cruiserweight guys. And we established their relationships and their backstories. So now when Chris Jericho, 2 years later, is all of a sudden dumping on Dean Malenko, it kind of matters. It wouldn't have mattered 2 years earlier. So my point in trying to answer your question was I think we were forced after a couple of years of cruiserweights. We had no choice but to get into stories and characters. But it didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't, it wasn't a cathartic moment where a light bulb went off in your head and you woke up and ran, to the desk so you could write down, the dream that you just had that was going to change the world. I think it just happened over time. Out of necessity is probably a better way to say it.
It was around this time that Jericho got his first t-shirt, which is a big deal whenever you get your first piece of merch. And he says that around this time, you know, the NWO was making hundreds of thousands of dollars based on their merchandise sales, but he didn't have a t-shirt, even though a guy like Rick Steiner, who he felt like he was getting better reactions than, did have a shirt. So he gets with the merch guys and he designs the Monday Night Nitro version of Monday Night Jericho for a t-shirt. And he does a Jerichoholic concept, and you sort of greenlight both of them, but maybe the royalty wasn't exactly what he was hoping for, because he says once he got a royalty check for $0.00. The actual stamp cost 37 cents. And he sort of jokes that his next royalty check after he had these shirts was for $0.37. Can you, and a lot of people have been really critical of the merchandise system that WCW had, or lack thereof, in that whenever they were with Vince, they would get this giant sort of statement, 50 pages or more. Here's everything that was purchased, and here's your cut of every little thing. And with WCW, that wasn't maybe the case. And I feel like that had to be brought up more than once by guys when they came over. What was the WCW answer to that? And do you agree that was maybe a weak point for Turner?
Of course it was a weak point. It's one of the reasons why we had guaranteed contracts, because we didn't have a sophisticated or mature or even a fundamental licensing and merchandising program. Not only did we not have an accounting formula that would allow us to report to talent what was being sold and where and what the royalties were. So we clearly didn't have that. But the reason we didn't have it is because we weren't selling anything. We didn't have a licensing and merchandising program. And yeah, there were guys who had t-shirts, and they made maybe, Rick Steiner maybe would sell 3 t-shirts, in an arena where there were 15,000 people. The only t-shirts that were selling were NWO. And even those royalties were a fucking mess because we didn't have the infrastructure figured out to track it, because WCW never had any licensing or merchandising other than maybe the chicken shit stuff you would sell at an arena, which was minimal. I mean, really minimal, for the most part. So, I mean, the criticism and no, it wasn't ever a problem for me, to be honest, because when guys were being hired, they all knew they were getting a guaranteed check, because right. I couldn't say to them with a straight face, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you 4.5% of all your merchandise. Because the next question would have been, great, how much merchandise do you think I'll sell? How much merchandise did Singh sell or anybody sell? Can you give me an example of what someone did last year? It would have been crickets. So it's a problem. Not in the beginning, not in 94, not in 95, not in 96, not even in 97. But by 98, when we're selling out houses, we're rocking pay-per-views, when we're stomping a mud hole in the WWF, when the ratings are going through the roof, when ABC is taking out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal, the network up front, trying to convince advertisers not to spend their money in wrestling, because WCW Nitro has 5 of the top 7 hours in all of television. At that point, yeah, a lot of the talent started feeling like, wait a minute, I know that we got this big guarantee, and I know what Eric told me, that the reason we're getting a guarantee is because we don't have a revenue sharing program, because they don't really have any revenue, but now they do when we want some. And it became a problem, but not until, probably 98 and certainly in 99.
One of the things that has sort of become legendary is a story that Jericho tells, that essentially the gist is his mom goes to buy an action figure, a Jericho action figure. She's all excited. She gets home and notices the receipt says Hulk Hogan action figure. And a lot of people are under the impression that Hogan had negotiated such a good deal for himself that any piece of merchandise that was sold for WCW, Hogan got a piece of. And that led Jericho to sort of freestyling. Hogan probably made more on the sale of the Jericho figure than Jericho did. How would you respond to that?
Do me a favor. When this show goes up, listen to yourself, listen to that question and just ask yourself if that makes any sense at all. So Jericho's suggesting, I guess, that, and maybe he was doing it tongue in cheek, but Jericho is suggesting that someone at a local Target in Calgary or a dollar store or wherever his mother bought an action figure, printed a receipt incorrectly, that somehow that was indicative of a Machiavellian marketing program masterminded by Hulk Hogan. I'm sorry. It's fucking insane.
Well, I mean, you did have Hulk Hogan on an insane contract where he was getting paid.
No. Okay, how insane was it? You're throwing it out there. You're entering facts and not in evidence, so let's bring out the evidence. How insane was it? And what percentage of Chris Jericho merchandise do you suggest Hulk Hogan got?
I think we should maybe just beat up the Hulk Hogan contract on another episode and not get sidetracked here.
Okay.
No, I have it in front of me.
So that's your version of I don't recall?
No, I don't. It's not that. It's a matter of you paid the motherfucker $20,000 a month to wear NWO t-shirts. You're giving him 25% of your net receipts and actual licensing fees for generic non-talent specific NWO merchandise. So he gets a piece of fucking everything that you do. Why would this be any different? In fact, he got a 50% royalty on the actual license fees received by WCW on the licensing of Hulk Hogan. So he gets 50% of everything for him and 25% of everything for the NWO. And oh, by the way, a $20,000 a month salary in order to just wear NWO shit in public. I mean, the thing goes on and on and on. I have it in front of me, but it just feels like this is going to be a shouting match that maybe we should table for another time.
I can't fucking wait.
Yeah, we'll cover that some other time. Bash at the Beach, 1998's in San Diego, and Rey Mysterio returns to a huge pop and pins Chris Jericho to win the WCW Cruiserweight title in about 6 minutes. And of course, they have Dean Malenko involved here. He tries to run from Malenko. Arn stops him because, of course, there's the horseman aspect, and we're off to the races. And most importantly, Mysterio got his return and his big payoff. So the next night on Nitro, JJ Dillon, Chris Jericho, Rey Mysterio, and Dean Malenko are all out for a conference. And the gist is Malenko and Mysterio are going to agree to wrestle later in the show for the #1 contendership because they're saying that this wasn't really fair what happened. Let's keep it moving here and talk about Road Wild, August 8th, 1998.
You're just dying to do this, aren't you?
What?
You're just dying to bust my balls about Road Wild.
Well, I am, but I feel like, man, we're having a good time talking about Jericho. We'll do it another time. Juventud wins the Cruiserweight title from Jericho here in 16 minutes and 24 seconds, 3.5 stars. It is sort of an interesting deal because we've still got this Malenko aspect where Malenko's all over these matches. This is a real Cruiserweight feud now at this point that's carrying over to the TV, to the pay-per-views everywhere. But a win here for the title for Juventud does feel a little bit out of left field, because seemingly once he was unmasked, you guys didn't do a lot with him. Why was Juvy the right guy here?
I would imagine, like we did so often, was to do something that was unpredictable.
There you go.
To get a reaction out of Chris, to give him something to bitch about.
Let's talk about the next night on Nitro. This is probably the moment that Jericho's been looking forward to. He does drop the Cruiserweight, but it's because the very next night he wins the TV title from Stevie Ray. I'm not saying the TV title is this prestigious belt, certainly here in 1998. However, he probably doesn't want that Cruiserweight tag, on him. So he's not tag title, but just the name. So he's sort of shed of that when he becomes the television champion here. And Meltzer sort of writes that maybe there were some other ideas for him. The idea proposed to Jericho was for Giant to be his bodyguard and for him to join the Black and White, but he turned it down, and probably rightfully so, because he'd become background for Hogan interviews and lose his individuality. Now, Chris would write that most of the group was made up of ex-WWF superstars, and it seemed obvious to him that you were enamored with Vince's old employees and wanted this to be the top heel group. And that's why he turned down the offer to join. He didn't want to sort of be part of the guys who helped lose its edge, because he felt like some of the new additions to the group had sort of made it not as cool as maybe it had been a year prior. What do you remember about him being discussed as being a member of the NWO and him allegedly turning it down?
First of all, he didn't turn down anything. Chris didn't have creative control. So there's a flaw in that premise of that recollection. Could it have been suggested? Could he have balked? Yeah, I'll go with that as a possibility.
Let me tell you what he says. He wrote in his book, I think it would be cool, but I've got a good thing going and I don't want to give that up by joining the NWO. I don't want to ride your coattails and I don't want you guys to ride on mine. He says it was a brash statement, but Eric didn't seem to care. And he said, if you don't want to be in the NWO, that's fine, but I still want the Giant to help you win the TV title. So let's keep the same finish. We'll figure out why he helped you later. Your thoughts?
I'll buy it. I mean, I'll buy that I said that.
Do you remember anybody else turning down or not? I mean, I know he didn't turn it down. You're saying
he didn't turn it down. He didn't turn it down. There was a constant discussion with Chris. It was his nature. Like I said, a couple times now, he was constantly pushing. He was constantly exploring. He was constantly suggesting throughout 97, in 98, in 99, or up until the time he left. And when I got to WWE and he was there, he was doing the same fucking thing. So that's Chris Jericho. All right. And there may have been some discussion about the NWO, which, by the way, I don't recall because I can't imagine that making any sense. The only thing that I really recall, and I'm probably fast forwarding just a little bit, is Chris really wanted to work with Bill Goldberg. And that was a problem for me for a lot of reasons, or a couple of reasons that were pretty significant. But anything that was discussed at that point was just a discussion and a suggestion. But I guarantee you, I never went to Chris and said, Chris, this is what I want you to do. And Chris said, no, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
That never happened.
Let's talk about something that did happen that was fucking over like Rover, man. He decided he wants to sort of rip off the Spinal Tap bit where the camera's backstage showing him try to get ready and walk to the ring, but he gets turned around and he's lost on his way to the ring. And he wants to keep mocking this bit by having security with him. And he's mocking Goldberg here, of course, because that was his famous entrance. But instead of using real security, he looks for something he can have fun with. And he debates using like local wrestlers, but instead he meets a guy that really became a big part of the act. Tell us about what you remember about Jericho personal security and Ralphus.
I think Ralphus worked on a ring crew, and you know, my recollection of it was vague, but it was a typical Chris Jericho thing. Hey, Eric, I got an idea. I want to talk to you about it. Full of energy, full of passion, and laid it out. And we did it. We might have done it at a house show. He may have tried it, you know, at a house show, and it got over. And everybody got behind it because it was the kind of thing that Chris was good at. It was, we had seen it, that kind of parody humor, smart ass, kind of smarmy heel was in his nature. And Ralphus was a goofy looking guy. He was an entertaining character and he loved doing it. Ralphus loved being that character so much it made it interesting. He took it as seriously as any actor would have taken it. And which is one of the reasons it worked. He loved it. So again, as I've done, the last half of the show, tip of the hat to Chris. I guarantee it wasn't Kevin Sullivan's idea. It wasn't my idea. Maybe Terry Taylor, because Terry had that kind of, he could do some funny shit. He could come up with some funny things once in a while. So I'll give it a 15% chance of that being a Terry Taylor idea, but I'd say 85% chance that was all Chris Jericho.
There's a fun bit here on the September 10th Thunder where he's working with Wrath and they're doing the gimmick where Ralphus is knocking on the door. Eventually they're trying to do something with the door and it accidentally gets caught on camera when things don't go exactly according to plan. And Jericho and Wrath are both caught laughing on live TV. The camera catches it. Any sort of blowback on that, or is it clearly an accident? And what are you going to fucking do? It's live TV.
You know what? There was no blowback, and things like that never bothered me.
Right.
And I know this is going to sound, bizarre to people, but when I launched Nitro, one of the things that I felt the most strongly about was that it be live, because I knew shit would happen just like that would make the show feel different. And it could be anything. It could be the lights, the power going out in the middle of a match. It could be anything, but it's what makes live television. I used to say this, and I'm going to really quit, dropping all the F-bombs, but I get excited and I drink all this yerba mate tea and I get all jacked up, and half the time you're pushing my buttons. So I'm going to blame it on you.
Sure.
But I used to tell in the very beginning, I said to Brad Siegel, why do you want to go live? It costs more money to go live than it does to do tape, which isn't really true, by the way, because there's no post-production on a live show. And post-production is what really can bog you down badly. But I told Brad in the very beginning, Flea's fucking live is interesting. Not everything that you watch on tape is really that, because when you watch something live, it's happening now. It's really happening, and anything can happen. And that was the core vibe, if you will, that I wanted to establish in Nitro, is that shit happens. Sometimes it's great shit, and sometimes it's like you just described. So for me personally, if I'd have been sitting back watching it on a monitor, I would have busted out laughing. Vince McMahon might have killed somebody. But that's just, the difference between the way we look at things. I think live TV should have flaws, just like a good character should have a flaw. But I would have laughed my ass off seeing that.
Let's talk about an incident he had with Scott Hall here. He wrote about it in his book, and he says that really he had been a bit of a dick for a while. And
who's he?
He being Scott Hall. He says
pronouns, pal, pronouns.
Thank you.
You should have that down by now.
Quote, "It was no secret that Hall enjoyed being a dick. And he said on more than one occasion, they pay me to wrestle, not to make friends. And it doesn't say anywhere in my contract that I have to be nice to anyone. This is the wrestling business, not the friendship business." Well, allegedly, Hall's sort of badgering him one night, and he gets sick of it and finally stands up for himself. And Hall says something like, "You got something to say, Jericho? Don't sing it. Bring it. I'll put an end to your little Terry Taylor push." And Jericho says that pissed him off huge, because he'd worked his ass off for that little Terry Taylor push, and he was be damned if somebody was going to mock him. Well, then Scott Norton comes over, looks him in the eye, him being Jericho, and says, "You better shut his mouth right now, because if you don't stand up to him, I will, and you'll look like a pussy." So Jericho goes and stands up and says, "Leave me the fuck alone. Next time you mess with me, I'm coming at you. Understand?" And Hall looks at him in disbelief and says, "I don't have a problem with you, dude. Come on, man. Everything's cool." And he sort of says this is just classic bully fashion and was typical of Scott Hall. This is 98. Everybody knows you had your situations with Hall. Is that about par for course for him in 98?
Absolutely.
That's a shame.
It is. It really is. And again, as you describe that, you're reading Chris's book. That's a scene that I can visualize as you're laying it out to me. It's almost like a movie I've seen 100 times. It all came about during that period of time. Scott was a wreck, and he would push people's buttons, and he could turn on a dime. I don't want to suggest that he was bipolar. I'm not a doctor or a psychiatrist or psychologist, whatever it would be. But if he wasn't, he sure did a good imitation, because one day you could just be the easiest guy in the world to get along with, and then 24 hours later, he would pull something exactly like you just described. It was not a good time.
Let's talk about Fall Brawl, 1998. This is where Jericho beat a fake Bill Goldberg in 1 minute and 15 seconds. This is directly from the Observer. It was all comedy. First, Jericho was walking around lost backstage, trying to get to the ring. Then Goldberg's music played, and a guy who looked to be about 5'2" came out, who I believe is either a Georgia indie wrestler who uses the name CC Deviline or sometimes jobber Johnny Attitude. And since he's just recently gotten his head shaved and got a Goldberg tattoo on his arm, this was perfect. What do you remember about this? It's a half a star match. Of course, it's not supposed to be a real match, but Meltzer ranks everything here. the fake Bill Goldberg match on pay-per-view, how does this come to be?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, you ask me these questions all the time. Whose idea was that? How did that happen? The answer is, it was a collaboration. It was probably a Chris Jericho idea that got to Kevin or Terry, that probably got talked about, laid out. Then it was probably brought to me, and I probably went, okay, it's consistent with what Chris was doing. It was a parody. It was comedic. It was some smart ass shit. It was very, very consistent with a lot of the things that were working with Chris. So I wouldn't have seen any reason not to do it. However, I will tell you that it didn't go over all that well with Bill.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get to.
It was the beginning. I may not remember who stood up in the room and went, "Hey, me. Well, I got an idea. Let's do this." That I can't remember. But I do remember the reaction it got.
Before you get to the reaction, let me tell you, Chris wrote in his book that it was Terry Taylor who told him he'd be wrestling Goldberg. And at the time he's TV champion, we should remind you that Goldberg here is, of course, the world champion. And when he finds out he's working Goldberg, he thinks it's strange that he's going to be in a 3-minute throwaway match like this on pay-per-view when he's the TV champion. But Terry explained, no, you're not facing the real Goldberg, but a quote unquote midget version of him instead. And he asked him why. And he said, no reason. I just thought you'd have some fun with it. So that was sort of the idea. Is WCW, at least Terry Taylor, had sort of realized, hey, we're doing comedy here. Let's double down on the comedy. But I get that in hindsight, maybe Bill didn't see the humor and probably blamed Jericho for some of this. Tell us what Bill's reaction was to this Goldberg squash here for Jericho.
He was hot. He was hot. I mean, I got an earful and a face full. I mean, he was in my face. He was hot. And again, it's easy to talk about this stuff 20 odd years later, but at that time, remember, again, put it in context, how green Bill Goldberg was.
Right.
At that time. Bill came into a Shark Tank.
Right.
And he got over, other than The Rock, other than The Rock, nobody's gotten over as fast, as big as Bill Goldberg at that time. And it was a lot for him. He didn't have a decade or more's worth of wrestling political experience. He didn't have a comfort level with the formula and could predict how the audience would take things. So he was really easily tipped over, especially when you had guys who were fucking with him. When you had a Scott Hall in his ear going, bro, I don't know why I wouldn't let them do that to me. And I'm not saying Scott did that, but that type of thing was very typical. Or any number of other people that were in his ear and influencing him because he didn't have his own basis of knowledge and experience to rely upon. Or Hulk Hogan would have pulled him aside. And Hulk would have pulled him aside and said, hey, Bill, just telling you, I would have never let them do something like that to Hulk Hogan when Hulk Hogan was first getting over. That something like that would make Bill go up in flames. So you can imagine how Bill reacted to that.
And he reacted the next day in Greenville, South Carolina. He says he saw, Jericho wrote, I saw Goldberg in the backstage area. He came up to me with fire in his eyes and a defiant grin and said, well, Jericho, I hope it was worth it. He asked what he meant, and he says, people have been calling me all day and laughing at me. Well, I don't do the comedy bullshit that you do, and I just want you to know you're going to pay the price for it. And Jericho wrote that he's sort of surprised by this. I mean, they both loved hockey. They went to a hockey game together. He thought they got along, and he thought he would have gotten a kick out of it. But he says, quote, as a result of the backstage vultures that were clouding his brain with manipulation, drooling at the thought of being one to end his streak, here we are. He says, I just work here, Bill. I wish I had the power to book matches, but I don't. And he sort of stomps off, Goldberg does, and says, I hope it was worth it. And of course, Jericho is now going to keep this angle going, whether it's his idea or WCW's, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But he's bragging in the ring that night on the show that Jericho won, Goldberg 0, and challenges him to a match. Of course, Goldberg doesn't answer. So he wins by count out and starts saying Goldberg 0, Jericho 2. And he's no longer calling him Goldberg. He's calling him Greenberg and saying things like, who's your daddy, Greenberg? Who's your daddy? And people are really ready for a match here, but it doesn't happen. And he runs into Goldberg at an airport, and Goldberg demands he stop doing the angle. Quote, I don't do comedy. And he tried to explain that he's not going to do it. And the fans are digging it, and he doesn't want to really pull back. And WCW allegedly is okay with this. And they're even advertising Goldberg versus Jericho on the September 28th Nitro. And Goldberg's there and just lays waste to the Jericho security force. And we're sort of not really getting the payoff we imagined with there being some sort of a pay-per-view build or whatever. What's your relationship like with dealing with Goldberg through this process? Is he sort of pushing back on all this? Did you have to talk him off the ledge a few times? What can you tell us? Yes,
I had to talk him off the ledge a lot. And the relationship between Bill and I had been getting strained up to that point. And again, it's because the stakes were getting higher. There were more people in Bill's ear. He was getting less and less secure because he went out now and instead of just going out and eating people, there was more and more story, being suggested to him from time to time. It was a very tough time for Bill. It was. And now to have this kind of thing happening, I mean, I think anybody else that had been in the business for 5 or 10 years, Chris was getting him over.
Right.
I mean, it really was. Chris was doing a favor, and so was WCW. But Bill didn't have the experience to see it that way. His perspective was all fucked up, and he would get absolutely impossible to be around.
Now, of course, the match is going to happen, and Jericho wrote in his book that you're the one who breaks the news to him. And when he says, what's the story for the match going to be? You said something like story, the same story Goldberg always tells. He beats you and pins you with the jackhammer in about 3 minutes. And Jericho says he thought he'd entered the twilight zone, like the previous 6 weeks of angles hadn't happened. And he says, what about our angle? The fans are really into it. And you allegedly said there never was an angle. And if there was, it ends tonight. And he's sort of just taken aback by this, that this can't be real, that they've just thrown away all of this that he felt like was really strong work. But that's the plan. On October 8th, there's a segment on Thunder where backstage Jericho's slamming on Goldberg's door. Goldberg's not there. And it's announced as if Jericho's going to take on Goldberg later in the show. And Jericho does an interview with, of course, his bodyguard and Tony Schiavone. And then he tells the referee, Mark Curtis, to get well. And he calls out Goldberg. Goldberg's music plays, but he never shows up. And Jericho has the referee put his hand in the air and ring the bell as if he were the winner. I mean, it is sort of weird that, the match happens. It's a squash. It's over really before it gets started, but he still continues the angle even after. Is this just too many chefs in the kitchen? How does this thing piss off one of the top talents, but yet we're still playing with it a little bit? And we're not, there's no payoff.
There's a layer of complexity that wasn't revealed in that book. And we touched on it. Chris Jericho was a heel. He was playing a heel. It was a cool heel and it was an entertaining heel, just like the NWO was in some respects, sometimes in many respects, but he was still a heel. Bill Goldberg was still Bill Goldberg at that point. There was no way that match was going to end any other way than the heel poking the bear, getting his heat, poking the bear next week, getting more heat, and continuing to get that heat until the bear finally met him in the ring and the heel got beat.
Right.
That's the formula.
Sure.
Chris didn't want to do that formula. Chris didn't see it that way. And it became an issue. Well, Chris wanted a legitimate angle, not a comedic angle, not the one that you just laid out to me. He wanted to be figured in with Bill Goldberg in particular at that time. And we weren't ready for that yet.
Meltzer would even put in here that Goldberg had nixed the idea, even after all the angles that had sort of started it, because he just didn't want to do anything with Jericho. And Meltzer would freestyle that Jericho was offered a program with Kidman, but Jericho, Guerrero, and Benoit and Malenko were all trying to move away from the Cruiserweight division because they didn't want that stigma. And they were putting pressure on guys to sign contracts. This is all directly from the Observer. Do you remember, being like, hey, sorry, you can't work with Goldberg, but what about Kidman?
No, I don't remember that.
Let's talk about Halloween Havoc, 1998. Jericho retains the TV title, beating Raven in 7 minutes and 49 seconds. It gets 3 stars here. It is sort of, I guess it's a move in the right direction because he's working with heavyweights, but it does feel a little bit like a consolation prize since he's not with Goldberg, which is what he wanted to do. The very next week on Nitro, November 2nd, he is doing an interview wearing a Goldberg t-shirt, and he's putting over Goldberg and talking about how he used to be a football player. And later in the show, he goes to a draw with Kidman. The next week on Nitro, Jericho does an interview running down Bill Goldberg, and then they show Goldberg arriving at the building, watching Jericho run him down on the monitor. And instead of going out there, he wastes valuable time destroying all the furniture backstage. And when he finally comes out, he wastes Jericho with a tackle on the floor. And for some reason, as we've talked about, he just didn't want to work the feud. And that's allegedly sort of the blow off here. He gets a win over Prince Iaukea a few days later on Thunder. And the big meeting about all this Goldberg stuff goes down on November 9th. And it happens before Nitro. And he says, you're going to lose. He says that you said something like, you're going to lose to Goldberg and that's it. And his thinking at the time was, quote, I didn't give a shit at that point because no matter what anybody else thought, that angle was a moneymaker and I was determined to live or die with it. If WCW didn't take it as far as it could go, I might as well quit anyway. If they didn't see this feud as a draw, then nothing I would ever do in the future would be either. Quote, I'm not losing tonight. And he says, you said angrily, go in my office right now. And he says, you must have suspected that you were going to question the match because Goldberg was already in your office all along with a very pissed off Hulk Hogan. And he says that some serious shit was about to go down. And he says, you said, this has gone on long enough. We've accommodated you enough. Tonight you're losing to Bill. And the 3 of them wait for my response. I wanted to lose to Bill. I just wanted to do it right. And people want to see him kick my ass and they'll pay to see it. And then he pleads his case to Hogan using language he knew he'd understand. Quote, I thought this business was about making money. You've done it better than anyone, Hulk. This match will make money. Hogan didn't disagree, but said, it's never bad to lose to the champion. And Jericho says, or Goldberg says rather, I'm sick of doing this comedy shit. You could never last in the ring with me. I'm the guy who stands in fire for my ring entrance. I'm the guy who beat Hogan for the title. And he says, you're the guy who would go down right now if I kicked you in the nuts. And so you jump in the middle and say, okay, let's not get carried away. What do you want to do? What's your idea? Do you remember, before we keep going here, this 3-way meeting and that basically being how it got started, or is Jericho using some creative license here?
I remember the night. I remember the debate. If Chris says Hulk was in the room, I can't remember clearly enough to suggest he wasn't. It would make sense. So I tend to believe that Hulk was there. Remember, as I said earlier on, Bill was very insecure when he was very confident in himself in every way, except for psychology, when it came to the wrestling business. So he ended up leaning on certain people. Hulk Hogan was clearly one of them, especially by that time. Hulk Hogan by that time had introduced his own attorney, Henry Holmes, to Bill. So Hulk was kind of taking Bill under his wing, so to speak. So it makes sense that Hulk would have been there. So we'll take Chris's version of how that all went down as being 100% accurate. And I do remember the tension that occurred that night, however it went down word for word. But keep in mind, one of the issues that I had personally, and one of the reasons why I didn't fight harder to support Chris is because Bill wasn't capable of going out and having the kind of match that Chris wanted to have.
Right.
Bill was still Bill Goldberg. That match was going to be a clusterfuck. Yeah, A, because Bill just didn't have the experience, and B, because of the way Bill was wired. Bill would have gone out there so tense and so tight and so pissed off that I don't know how, as talented as Chris Jericho was, I think he was overestimating his own abilities based on his desire to do what he wanted to do, because I don't think he could have gone out there and had a match that he would have been proud of with Bill Goldberg. There was a lot of reasons why that match wasn't going to happen. And it wasn't all because I didn't believe in Chris. It just wasn't the right match.
So Jericho says that, you guys say, well, hey, what's your fucking idea? And he lays it out. Okay, I'm going to come out here and trash him. And Okerlund's going to say, everybody knows Bill's not here. But then Bill shows up on the Tron, comes down, spears him down the aisle exactly as it was. And that sets up a match at the pay-per-view. And he loses at the pay-per-view. He just wanted to work with Goldberg on the pay-per-view. And allegedly, everybody likes the idea, but Goldberg says something like, that's all well and good, but I'm supposed to have the next pay-per-view off. So instead, the plan is World War III. And instead of Goldberg working with Chris Jericho, Jericho works with Bobby Duncombe Jr., 13 minutes and 19 seconds. What would have been the harm in having the blow off happen at World War III instead of having Jericho work with Bobby Duncombe fucking Jr.?
Did the blow off ever happen?
Just the spear down the aisle, and that was it.
I'll go back to what I just said. You're asking a question 2 different ways or 3 different ways. I told you earlier on, there's just no way that match was ever going to happen. Bill wasn't capable.
But I mean,
it's really, go ahead.
Why not squash? I mean, why not just book the standard? Everybody knows. I mean, we all know he's going to get squashed. Like, the expectation was not a 20-minute match, but a fucking squash. Do you think Jericho
did Chris ever say that to you? Or, I mean, not to you, but is there any in his book? Did Chris say, all I want to do is go out and get squashed on a pay-per-view?
No.
He wanted a match. He wanted an angle with Bill. He wanted to get in the ring and have a match with Bill. He got squashed, and he wasn't happy with that.
Allegedly, let me correct that. He does say, and then we wrestle at World War III, and he destroys me in the most entertaining squash match of all time. But still, you're saying that's not really what he was saying. He wanted a real fucking match.
And it just was, the chemistry wasn't there between those two.
Right.
It just wasn't there. And that, by the way, it's not, Bill being a bitch and Chris being wrong, or me, pandering to Bill, or Hulk stirring up shit. There are times when certain talents don't match. The chemistry isn't right. Ric Flair, Rick Rude. I mean, there are times, there are people that just don't work well together. And given what had gone down with Bill and Chris in the comedy, which wasn't Chris's fault, he was doing what he was asked to do. Bill overreacted to it, but it doesn't matter. The chemistry wasn't there.
He says that the fact that he couldn't even get a pay-per-view squash with Goldberg showed him that WCW didn't really see him as a moneymaker or a big league player. And his attitude about the company sort of started to become, quote, the same as when you call a girl 10 times and she never calls you back. You start off hoping she'll call, then you get bummed out, then desperate. Then you realize it's time to move on and give up. Had he called me back any time before the Goldberg angle was kiboshed, I would have signed. But the moment I found out that the angle was shit canned, I wasn't interested in being part of WCW no mo. Of course, the day I found out the angle had been dropped like a baby was the day Eric showed up with a contract for me to sign. He took it out of his little knapsack and told me to sign it on the spot. I hemmed and hawed and told him I needed to have a lawyer look over it first. Once I made up my mind to not sign the deal, I called Vince Russo. I told him that I wanted out, and he suggested a meeting with Vince McMahon himself. So he made arrangements for me to fly to Connecticut in a top secret meeting at Vince's house. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, I avoided Bischoff like he had leprosy or was a cruiserweight. If he was walking down the hall, I'd duck, dip, dive, and dodge into a nearby dressing room. He wasn't stupid, and I'm sure he must have suspected something was amiss. Finally, he caught up with me in Chicago at the United Center, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Have you signed your contract yet?" I started, "Well, my lawyer still hasn't," and he interrupted me to say, get it back from your lawyer and get it signed next week. He was on to me and the jig was up. What do you remember about, him sort of playing hokey pokey with signing a contract here and it seemingly happening at the same time as this Goldberg situation?
It probably was happening at the same time, but I don't think I would have, I don't want to call Chris a liar. I'm not doing that, but it would be 100% uncharacteristic of me to pull a contract out, put it in somebody's face and say, now sign it.
Right.
Nobody did that.
Right.
Nobody did that. Nobody did it. And I certainly wouldn't have expected Chris to do it. So right off the bat, I'm kind of throwing a flag on that one. Just the way it started out. I do remember being pretty anxious. I do remember being concerned because we had plenty of conversations. It was clear to me that Chris didn't get what Chris wanted. Chris wanted that pay-per-view match with Bill Goldberg. He felt he deserved it. He felt that it was money. It's what he wanted for himself. He believed, I'm sure, that it was good for the company, and he didn't get what he wanted. And I knew he was unhappy, and I suspected that he was going to leave. So I would say 80% of everything that he laid out in that book is probably pretty accurate. The part I'm not going to buy is that I pulled a contract out of my knapsack and said, here, sign it. That I'm not buying that, or that I expected to have it, 2 days later or 3 days later. And I'm not to sound like a pussy, but it just, every time I hear Chris, and I'm sure, maybe Chris and I have talked about a lot of things in the last couple of years that we both, look back and reflect on and going, holy shit, we kind of palm ourselves in the forehead, thinking about some of the things that we've said and done. And we both have a much different perspective on things now than we did 20 years ago. But it still kind of bothers me to hear Chris, even if it was 5 or 10 years ago, shit all over the cruiserweights by saying something like I avoided him like a cruiserweight. Because I just, that's like me being pissed off at Vern Gagne for giving me an opportunity to get into the wrestling business.
Right.
I just don't get that. That's a level of disrespect that I just can't relate to.
He talks about his meeting with Vince McMahon. He gets picked up, and he's thinking he's getting the old Vince McMahon treatment. So we're going to fly you in first class and pick you up in a limo. He flies him coach, which surprises him, but he does have a limo driver pick him up, and he's got a name on the placard that says Robinson, which is a code name that Russo had given him. And then they drive him to the woods of Connecticut. They finally make it to Vince's house. Shane answers the door, and Jericho's sort of prepping to try to make sure he looks like what Vince might want. He's wearing a skin tight shirt. He's got boots on that have lifts in them, so he looks a little taller, and he's doing what he can to sort of look like a big guy, which is what he's always been told that Vince likes. And when he gets to the sunken living room, he sees an oil painting of Vince over the mantle, and everybody's there. Jim Ross, Vince Russo, Ed Ferrara, and Bruce Pritchard. And of course, the head of the table is Vince McMahon himself. And they sort of, catch up briefly and then have lunch that Vince had ordered in and then go for a walk. And he describes being in Vince's presence as unlike anything else he'd been, around in the wrestling business before. He said, he's trying to compare him to you here. And he says, it was like comparing a king to a court jester. How would you make his comparison? And Vince McMahon does have a presence about him. I think everybody who has ever met him would agree with that. I don't know how much of that is by design and how much of that is just out of respect from us as wrestling fans, but it's certainly something that you can't deny. But when he sort of compares Vince McMahon and Eric Bischoff as a king and a court jester, how would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think anybody that would ever meet, especially going back to 1997, 1998, would have ever confused. Let me just put it this way. If both Vince and I were in a lineup, nobody would ever confuse one for the other.
Right.
I didn't try to pretend to be something that I wasn't. Never have, actually, and never will. I don't have an oil painting of myself, in my dining room. I don't portray that type of a person. It's not important to me. So I'm sure there was a very distinct, and I know there is. I've been around Vince. I get it. I am a completely different person. And if Chris kind of felt the need to write that in a derisive way and, take a shot at me, so be it. He's writing a book. He's got to do what he's got to do. If he really felt that way, so be it. I'm a pretty confident person in myself and who I am. And I don't really take offense to it. Disappointed that Chris felt the need to take a shot, because I still feel like I was responsible in many ways for for Chris to even have an opportunity to fly and coach and wear a tight shirt, put lifts in his shoes, to try to pretend he was somebody that he really wasn't. I gave him that opportunity. And to feel like he has to take a shot in his book along the way to help get himself over, that's okay.
He describes the meeting as a total smoke and mirror show designed to impress him, and it worked. He says the whole experience was surreal. And he wrote in his book, as far as I know, Eric never found out about the secret meeting unless he's reading this book. Sorry, Eric. And he says he was on a mission, he being you, to have him sign that contract. And finally, he breaks the news that he's not going to. And he says, truth be told, I felt bad about my decision because my word had always been my bond, and I felt like I was going back on it. But I did feel justified in my actions by telling myself that since he'd taken 5 months to get back to me about the contract, he was in breach of our verbal agreement. I know I'm grasping at straws here, but if you're going to say I went back on my word, there should at least be an asterisk. And he says, when you finally have this meeting, you're furious. Quote, you can't do that. What's wrong with you? We have a deal. You can't go back on your word. What do you remember about this? And obviously the result is going to be, you saying something like, well, if you won't sign, it's like losing your ticket at the Chinese dry cleaner. No ticky, no laundry. I wasn't exactly sure what that meant until Jimmy Hart told me I was losing the TV title to Conan on Nitro that night in Chattanooga. What do you remember about the meeting and the no ticky, no laundry? Cause I do feel like no ticky, no laundry is a fucking shirt at ericbischoff.com.
Here's the only thing that I guess I'd throw a flag on is I wasn't furious. I mean, I was disappointed, and I did, I think I offered Chris, and this is, I think I offered him $500,000, close to it, to stay. I mean, I really wanted him to stay, but I wasn't surprised and I wasn't furious. I might have given him the no ticky, no laundry thing. That sounds like something I would say. Pretty fucking stupid. I know. But I will take exception to being furious. I wasn't. I was disappointed, but I wasn't furious.
You know what? Just that entire scene is hilarious to me. No, Eric, I'm sorry. I'm not going to sign. I'm going to go work for Vince. Oh yeah? Well, fuck you. You're losing the TV title to Conan and goddamn Chattanooga. No ticky, no laundry, Chris Jericho. It's hilarious.
It wouldn't have gone down like that. Trust me.
Jimmy Hart, get that fucking belt off this kid. No ticky, no laundry. Hey, Conan, where the fuck is K-Dog? You're the new TV champ, you fucker. It's hilarious to me. Let's think about something else that's absurd to me. Chris wrote in his book,
well, that's not absurd enough. What the hell? What do you want? You want to take a ride to the Twilight Zone?
Let's get better. Allegedly, fucking Ralphus was trying to negotiate a contract. Supposedly,
oh, get the fuck out of here now. Now you're making shit up.
No.
Oh, either you are or Meltzer is.
I'm being serious. This is directly from his book.
Well, then he's making it up. He was on a roll. He was laughing his ass off writing this shit and decided he was going to make it really funny. Ralph was, come on. Come on, Jericho. Now I'm pissed.
Quote,
now I'm pissed.
He began talking about hiring a lawyer to negotiate his new contract. New contract? The moron didn't have an old contract. I had to go to bat for him to get him $500 an appearance as it was. And then he started showing up at house shows, quote, in case he was needed. The first night he was cheered so huge it killed all my heel heat, and I had to tell him to stop coming. Sadly, Ralphus was over than most of the baby faces. Did you have any interactions with Ralphus at all?
No.
That's
but I do find it interesting that Chris had to finally admit that Ralphus was more over than he was. But that,
God, listen to you. You're fired up today. I love it.
No, but I love to have fun. Look, man, this is a tennis match. I'm not going to stand here on the edge of the fucking tennis court with my racket in my hand, getting served fastballs between the eyes. You got to let me grab my racket and play.
He says he being Chris Jericho turns to Kevin Nash of all people for help because he hears that there was an agent involved in the deal they cut with WCW. So he first comes in contact with Barry Bloom, and it's another secret meeting, but he says this one is the smartest move he could have made. He says Barry orchestrated a foolproof plan for my escape and played Eric like a temperamental fiddle. At first, Eric refused to deal with him due to previous bad blood. So Barry had me hire a lawyer in Atlanta named John Taylor. John had fought against WCW in the past, and Bischoff was reluctant to deal with him too. But I had hit Bischoff in the hornet's nest with a stick, and he was furious. He was prepared for him to make the remainder of my time in the company a living hell. And surprisingly, he didn't. Tell me about your relationships with Barry Bloom and John Taylor and how or why any of that was really not your deal.
That was way, way more colorful than the facts were. He's right about Barry Bloom. In my opinion, Barry was, he betrayed a trust in a friendship. He went against his word. We've covered that before. I'm not going to beat it up any longer. I didn't, and to this day, I've had one conversation with Barry in the last 20 years that I can recall. And it had to do with Bill Goldberg for another television project that I was going to do about a year ago that had nothing to do with wrestling. But that was it. If it came to the wrestling business, I won't deal with Barry Bloom ever. Enough of that. But he did bring John Taylor in, and I had a great relationship with John Taylor. I really did.
Can I give you a scoop here that you might not believe?
Sure.
Barry Bloom listens to this podcast.
I don't give a fuck.
No, I'm not saying you're going to change what you're saying. I'm just saying what a fucking small world it is. Hey, Barry, Eric's shitting on you. Roll Tide.
No, I'm not shitting. I'm just telling the truth. No. And he knows I'm telling the truth.
I'm just having fun.
But he, it wasn't this big Machiavellian super move and Barry Bloom playing me like a fiddle. I'm sure Barry, suggested get an attorney, John Taylor. John Taylor was in Atlanta. John Taylor did work with the WWE, but I had a really good, even though it was, kind of adversarial from time to time, John Taylor and I ended up being pretty good friends. John Taylor ended up representing me at a certain point because we had that kind of a relationship. So there was no big mastermind, super fucking manager move. It was just, the series of events that took place. Chris wanted to leave. I didn't want him to go. I tried to keep him. I offered him a lot of money. He was determined to leave, and he left. There was nothing more dramatic or colorful to it than that.
Let's talk about Starrcade 1998. We get Conan beating Chris Jericho here in 7 minutes and 27 seconds.
I told him no ticky, no laundry.
There you go.
Damn.
I needed that. 2.25 stars. Let's roll into 1999. They're working an angle here pretty early in the year, January 11th, where Jericho attacks Perry Saturn and puts a dress on him. And that sets up the match that sold out. Jericho versus Saturn. The loser has to wear the dress for 90 days. You would think, considering Jericho's on his way out and allegedly had a bit of a falling out with Bischoff, he himself would lose and have to wear the dress. Not so. Perry Saturn loses. Meltzer gives it 3/4 star. Why not put Jericho in a fucking dress here?
Because Perry really, really liked the dress.
Oh, that's the fucking line of the show right there. Chris says, I wrestled a battle royal. This happens on Beach Brawl for MTV on January 21st. And it's in
Can you see Perry right now with that one boogly eye?
I can.
In a nice little prom dress, kind of one of those, I don't know what they call them, maybe a ring skirt, kind of like the old fashioned style. And then Perry look at you with that bald eye and a tattoo going up the side of his neck with that one boogly eye.
It's crazy. Chris says he wrestled in this battle royal for MTV at spring break in Cancun. And he says, I won and I went out drinking for 14 straight hours with the host, a relative unknown named Kid Rock. in celebration. Only in WCW could you get a bigger push when you were leaving the company, which is kind of fun. He finds out right after all of this that he's failed the WCW drug testing policy, and the banned substance that was found in the system was andro, which was involved in Mark McGuire's supplement of choice, of course, at the time. And it's in a lot of stuff, even something he bought at GNC in the mall. And he says, quote, "The fix was in. As penance, I had to attend a steroid counseling session with the company quack in Atlanta with two other wrestlers, Lenny Lane and Bobby Blaze. Lenny was about my size and Bobby was built like you. I keyed. None of us were typical poster boys for rampant steroid abuse, although I was a sexy beast and worked out hard. But it was strange that the three of us had been targeted while so many others in WCW who had practically neon signs on for it. It is sort of weird timing. And this is one of those old deals in wrestling where when you're leaving, then you get popped."
No. I'm not even going to let you go down that path. We didn't administer that test. That test was subcontracted. Harvey Schiller, who was the president of the U.S. Olympic Committee, before he came to Turner Broadcasting, set up the drug testing policy at that time with a doctor who administered it to the U.S. Olympics. And the policy and the protocol would never have provided, despite the conspiracy theory or the Machiavellian kind of closing chapters of Chris Jericho's WCW book, that would suggest that was some kind of a final parting shot. It reads really, really well, but there is no substance to it whatsoever. It's a figment of Chris's imagination when he wrote that book. Not saying it didn't happen. Probably did happen. But our testing was a mess, just like everybody else's was at that point. The science hadn't really caught up with the challenge. The protocol was a mess for us, for the WWF, for the NFL, for Major League Baseball, for everybody. So I'm not suggesting we were pristine and bulletproof, but to suggest even a little bit that was a party shot, nah, throwing a major flag on that one.
Super Brawl is another rematch. Jericho and Perry Saturn. Surprisingly, Jericho wins again. Couple stars here, but it's another win for Jericho on his way out. I mean, back in the day when you were leaving the territory, you lose on TV all the time. Why are you sort of going against the grain here? Are you still keeping out hope that maybe you'll be able to convince him to stay, or why does he keep winning on pay-per-view like this?
I don't know. Can't answer that.
Well, he does lose at Uncensored, if that makes sense. It's the best of three, maybe on pay-per-view. Perry Saturn beats Jericho there at a dog collar match, and it gets only half a star. Meltzer didn't love the match, but it is not, it's finally something that's not like, a wearing a dress match. And Meltzer sort of freestyles that the decision was not at this point yet concrete. It's written, Bischoff had a discussion with Jericho about his future and made it clear WCW wanted to keep him. Despite what you may have heard, at this point, WCW has not offered him a new huge money contract, although at some point everyone expects they will. There's been talk in the office, and I'm not sure it's been proposed to Jericho directly, that they would give him a Piper's Pit type segment weekly on Nitro if he were to sign. Those close to him seem to feel he's not 100% in either direction, but probably leaning towards leaving. So although Jericho's sort of saying he's got his mind made up, he's met with Vince, and unless you're offering him $1 million, he's not staying. No such offer comes, of course. At this point, maybe you didn't know for sure that he was leaving, or had you already sort of thought, well, I could sign him?
No. And again, you're relaying, facts as they were represented in Jericho's book.
Right.
We're combining that with, Meltzer freestyling. And I would say between the two of them, there's some truth in all of it. The exact timing of those sequence of all of the events as you're laying them out are probably suspect to a certain degree, to a large degree. I'm certainly not capable of, in a definitive, positive way that I believe in myself, arguing the timeline in all of that. I can tell you that there was a period, and I can't remember for the life of me, nor should any reasonable person expect me to remember. I can't remember exactly when the timing was of, I didn't know about, Jericho's trip, obviously, to WWE. I knew that he wasn't happy as a result of the everything that went down with Goldberg. I knew that there were issues. I knew that he was on the fence. We talked about it. He wasn't hiding anything. It was pretty clear to me where he was going. And I did try, as I said 20 minutes ago, I was willing and able to offer him $500,000 to stay. And I was really hoping he'd take it, but he didn't. Now, where all of those facts kind of fell out within the timeline as you're laying it out, I can't tell you. And by the way, neither could Chris, and Dave Meltzer never knew in the first place.
We'll talk about the contract in a minute. I want to wrap up the actual online storyline stuff, or on camera storyline stuff. Once they're on Nitro, the night after this dog collar match at Uncensored, Booker T beats Chris Jericho, and Jericho sprains his ankle here. So he's out of the ring for a little bit. We fast forward to April 5th, and there is a U.S. title tournament, and Booker T beats Chris Jericho here. And that's the last time we're going to see Jericho on WCW TV. Jericho wrote, "When Eric realized I wasn't going to re-sign my contract, he suspended me from appearing on TV. That darn suspension really taught me a lesson, especially since I received every penny of my weekly paycheck in the process."
See, okay, I'm going to stop you right there, because that's the kind of bullshit narrative that guys like Chris Jericho have used in the past to get themselves over. From my point of view, why would I put a guy on television that I know there's nowhere to go with him. There's no story to tell with him. I'm not going to put him on TV just to beat him. I never believed in that. If I knew somebody was going and I knew there wasn't a way to tell a good story, or at least attempt to tell a good story with a character, because I knew he was on his way out the door, not committed, I'm not going to put him on TV. Period. End of conversation. But it had nothing to do with anything other than, there was no suspension. It was simply, he was gone. There was nowhere to go with him, and there was no reason to give him television real estate. That's it. Anything else is Chris trying to put himself over.
He does sort of say that basically. He says, Eric, however, had enough of me and felt it was best for Chris Jericho to just disappear from WCW. My name was never mentioned, and I was never seen on Nitro again. It was probably the right decision, as no matter what form of burial he might have thought of, I would have just taken it and gotten more over in the long run anyway. WCW had taught me the valuable lesson of taking any scrap of TV time given to you and using it to make an impression. Let's talk about the contract. He does say that the WWF's contract offer was a 3-year deal at $450,000 a year, and it had this intricate system of bonuses based on attendance and pay-per-view buys. And if you worked hard in the company and succeeded, you were rewarded and made more money. He says during all the years he was there, he never made less than double his guarantee, sometimes triple. In the meantime, WCW had upped their offer to where with bonuses had almost reached that magical 7-figure mark, but it was too late. He says, quote, even though the WWF was offering half the money, I would have agreed to a bag of used hockey pucks to work for Vince. All the bullshit I experienced in WCW had drained my love for wrestling, and I wanted it back. In hindsight, do you think the tipping point in all of this is the Goldberg situation?
Yep.
If you had it to do over again, would you have done anything any differently?
I may have handled it differently. I may have perhaps tried to have been more diplomatic about it. But fuck, even in hindsight, Bill Goldberg at that time was not capable of having the kind of match that Chris Jericho wanted to have. Chris Jericho wanted to be in that Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Randy Savage category, and he wasn't. And it's not that he wasn't as talented. He was in many ways more talented. But when you had a roster as deep as I had that was working as well as it was, you can't just insert somebody because they want to be inserted. No matter how bad Chris wanted it, he wasn't ready for it, and we weren't ready for it. We really weren't. And I'm going to tell you an interesting story. It's a conversation that Chris and I had probably a year and a half or 2 years ago. And hopefully Chris won't be too hot after he hears this, because I am calling bullshit on some of this stuff. And it doesn't bother me really, because I know that Chris wrote this book a while back, and I know that Chris is going back and writing about feelings he had at that time. But a lot of the feelings that he had at that time were not necessarily justified. They didn't really have a 360-degree perspective. They were Chris Jericho's perspective,
right?
And he really probably felt that way. But a little one-sided, if you will. But Chris and I were talking maybe a year or two ago, and we talked about, the transition when he left WCW, and he thought he was absolutely ready and he was going to fit right into WWE. And he realized very early that he wasn't nearly as over or nearly as ready as he thought he was. Once he got that opportunity, he realized, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't want to put words in Chris's mouth, but the way I interpreted it was Chris telling me that, when you're young, when you're hungry, when you want something so badly, you think you're ready until you get that opportunity and you find out you're really not, or you recognize how much work you have to do to really get ready. And in the context of the conversation Chris and I were having, it was really about the difference in the WWE style and the WCW style, if there was one. But the WWE has a very unique style and expectation of talent. And Chris thought he was ready for it and found out he wasn't, not nearly as ready as he thought he was. And I think that perspective that he had, 20 years later was probably an accurate perspective, even from my point of view back then. And now compound that challenge by the fact that the guy that he wanted to have a match with in an angle that ended up on a pay-per-view, which, by the way, he did want to have more of a match from what I recall. He did want it to be more of a story than just a squash, because we had that opportunity and it wasn't good enough. He wanted more, but Bill Goldberg wasn't the right dance partner. That was it. And there's nothing in 2020 hindsight. There's nothing I could have done back then to change that fact.
Right.
To answer your question, what would I have done? Would I have put fucking Bill Goldberg in a time machine and given him 20 years worth of experience? Would I have gotten into his head and hired a couple shrinks and talked him off the ledge and made him really excited to get into a match with a guy that had been dumping heat on him for 6 or 7 weeks, comedic or not?
Right.
Yeah, if I could have done any of those things, I would have done it differently, but they weren't really within my reach.
Jericho made $50,590 in 1996. He started in August of 96. In 97, he made $164,496. In 1998, he made $240,358. And in 99, he made $175,116. So his income was certainly rising, but he wound up going and getting a raise in the WWF, and the rest.
ATM Vince. Fucker would do anything in the world. He would spend whatever money he had to spend to get WCW talent. He had to take a star that I made in Chris Jericho and pay him 3 times more money. He was so desperate that he had to pay him millions, where, as you just pointed out, I was getting by with low 6 figures because I was more prudent with my cash. But not Vince McMahon, not big bad billionaire Ted. He had to try to put WCW out of business by stealing my talent and spending any amount of money he could possibly spend on them. How's that for fucking narrative?
I love you for that. That is the best. I almost want to end it right there, but we promised we were going to take some questions. Let's rapid fire some and let's get out of here. I don't know that we're going to beat that. Matthew wants to know, Eric, you seem to be a person who appreciates someone who takes risks and has a set of balls. Did you ever consider Jericho as a top tier guy, or did you have to weigh the pros and cons of the Hogans, Halls, and Nashes? Basically, was there someone other than Goldberg that you felt like would push and not, that you could push and not get heat with the top boys?
I pushed the guys that made money. Bill Goldberg was making money. Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were making money. If we go back and we look at 96 and 97 and 98 and even early 1999, those guys were making money for us. So there was no reason to insert underneath guys and force guys into an upper deck or an upper card where that was already too crowded. We were already top heavy with top talent that was making money. So it wasn't about taking risks and being afraid of upsetting any of the other boys. That's just Dave Meltzer narrative for the most part, but it wasn't my reality then.
Tom has a pretty fun question here. Hypothetically, if Jericho would have stayed, what would the plans have been?
I don't do hypotheticals.
You know, Meltzer sort of freestyled that maybe one of the ideas was that he might get a Piper's Pit type segment on Nitro. Was that ever discussed to the best of your recollection?
No.
Dave wants to know, was there any heat between you and Jericho over him having nicer hair?
I was a little jealous. I've always wanted to be blonde, and that wave in his hair, particularly when it gets a little bit longer and falls just gently just below the shoulder. And if you see him in the sunlight, oh my God.
Francis wants to know, who came up with Jericho's WCW theme? Was that Jimmy Hart?
Oh, could have been. Jimmy came up with a lot of the music. Sometimes we would use music that was part of the Turner Music Library.
Right.
We would find, Jimmy, more than likely it was Jimmy, would pull, a dozen or 24 songs that kind of, in Jimmy's opinion, fit the character, and then sit down with the talent and kind of go through it. So that was, I would guess that's the process.
Mike wants to know, who did Eric think had the best matches with Jericho in WCW?
Benoit.
Ben wants to know, what did Eric think of Jericho's WWE debut?
I didn't see it.
Oh, okay. Nishad wants to know, do you feel Jericho had more of an impact as a cruiserweight or a main event star?
Cruiserweight.
Bobby wants to know, what did Eric see as Jericho's quote unquote ceiling when he first saw him?
I didn't I didn't think of his ceiling. I looked at him as a great fit and somebody that was cast properly into the cruiserweight division. And the cruiserweight division was something that I had just as much enthusiasm and excitement for and belief in as anything that I had at the top of the card. I think that's the thing that, throughout this whole interview or show, it's the one thing that kind of gets in my craw even more than some of Dave Meltzer's silly horseshit, is that, to disrespect something that, the wrestling fans today hold in very high regard. Most of the talent that I talk to now, looking back, hold in very high regard. So, when I say I looked at Chris as an important part of the cruiserweight division, for me, is just as important as saying I looked at Chris as a guy who could have been in a main event. Because to me, the cruiserweight division was just as important as the main event. In some cases, more important, which is why I put it on the middle of the show, because I needed to hold the audience, and I knew that they could. If that's not a vote of confidence for a division and the people in it, I don't know what is.
David wants to know, the Monday Night Jericho shirt is still popular today. How were Jericho's merch sales back then?
They were horse shit, like we talked about. We didn't have a good merchandising infrastructure. We didn't have retailers. We didn't have licensees. We didn't have anything. And and I know it's easy to want to knock WCW for that, because that's kind of what the fashion was at the time, because that's how guys got themselves over when they left.
Right.
But if you think about the business of the wrestling business, and I'm going to bore you to death, and this has been about a 3.5 hour show, it feels like, but here was the reality then. I don't know what it's like now, because I'm clearly not in the business at this point. But back then, just because we got hot in 96 and 97 and 98, licensees, they don't jump on you. Oh my God, you got really good ratings last Monday. Let's go do a licensing deal with you. You're big companies. And we eventually got them. In 1998, I landed Electronic Arts for a video game. $10 million guarantee, half of it up front. I still got the jacket they gave me the day I closed the deal. But eventually we got some of those big licensing and merchandising deals in 98 based on the success that we started in 96. But in 96 and 97, we couldn't get anybody to do a licensing deal with us. There were no toy companies that mattered that wanted to do a deal with us. Nobody that wanted to do business with us in 96 and 97, even in early 1998, were generating the kind of money that mattered. And as a result of not having a licensing and merchandising infrastructure in place, because before I took over the company, there was absolutely no licensing and merchandising. There wasn't a need to create an infrastructure because there was no revenue to flow through it. So by the time we actually got hot enough to begin starting to see some of that money, the wheels were already falling off in 99. And that's the unfortunate part about that. But when I talk about WCW not having the infrastructure, it's not because they were completely incompetent. It's not because nobody wanted it. It's not because nobody gave a shit. It's because it was such an immature company. Even though it had been around technically since 1989 or 1990, when Ted Turner bought it out of bankruptcy from the Crockett's and renamed it WCW, as a business model, it was completely immature. It was almost like a startup, only in some cases worse because it had baggage. That was a long-winded answer, wasn't it?
It was, but it was worth it. And that's why people are listening. Last question here. Todd wants to know, did you think Chris would reach the levels he did in WWE?
No, I didn't. I didn't think that Vince would give Chris as much of an opportunity and take as much of a risk on Chris as he did. It's not that I didn't think Chris had the talent. I clearly did, but I never would have dreamt or bet that Vince would give him the ball the way Vince did.
Well, man, that's our Chris Jericho episode. Stay tuned next week. We're going to bring you Dusty Rhodes, but first, you sort of teased at the top of the show that occasionally you could be wrong. And when you were wrong, well, he said you'd fill us in. What's on your mind, Eric?
Well, but I preface that by saying, but when I'm right, I'll also fight and prove I'm right. And I know you had just so much fun busting my balls last week about what time of day it was when DX showed up at the building. As a matter of fact, I think, I don't have it written down in front of me, but I saw all of the tweets on my timeline for the last week. It was fucking daylight. How many times have I read that in the last 72? It was fucking daylight.
The best one I saw was when someone said that we should get a sponsorship from NyQuil and DayQuil, and there could be the NyQuil so you can rest. And then the other side should, the DayQuil could just say, it's fucking daytime. Which is great.
And I thought about that, and I thought that was really funny. It would make a really good shirt. But then I thought about the irony of this entire situation. Irony. You know what the irony is, Conrad?
What's that?
You love watches, don't you?
I do. Yeah. How did you know that?
Oh, I know a lot.
Okay.
I do my research too.
Okay.
And I was so taken aback by the fact that you busted my balls so fucking effectively.
Thank you.
And it got over so well with the audience that it made me ponder. That's right. I said ponder.
Okay. And
I pondered away until I thought to myself, how could I possibly have gotten that one inside out? I mean, I admit, and I admitted when we started this show, this stuff all happened 20 years ago. I produced over 6,000 hours of television in my career. I don't know how many pay-per-views. I don't know how many thousands of live events. And it all kind of runs together. So it's really hard for me, unlike some people who live and die by dirt sheets, it's really hard for me sometimes to recall specific moments in time. But even that, because that was such a critical moment, that being the DX invasion, and the fact that you just laid waste to me so effectively, I thought, how could I have let that be? So I started pondering and looking back, and I went, wait a minute. That happened in April of 98.
Mm-hmm.
That's That's Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah. Sunset was at 7:50 that night.
But it doesn't get dark until 8:50. It's called twilight.
Here's what I'm saying.
I was outside at 8:50 Eastern Time.
No, the sunset at 7:50 Eastern.
It's sunset. It's not dark.
All right, I'm with you on that, but that's clearly a fucking pre-tape. They're not.
So then what I did, no, part of it was a pre-tape. So then what I did is I'm fucking pondering my ass off.
Okay.
Is I decided I'm going to call my friend Sean Waltman.
Oh.
And I'm going to say, Sean, I'm just wondering, because I can't for the life of me imagine how I can recall, even though I know I'm capable of remembering things incorrectly, because after all, it was 20 years ago, and I am as guilty as some people of remembering things the way I want to remember them, but this one feels really fucking vivid to me, and I vividly remember looking down to my left and seeing that others waving like she was on fire, trying to get my attention, and I'm thinking, why the fuck would I have done that in the middle of the afternoon? Why wouldn't I have just said, what's up, Yannette? What's on your mind? But I didn't do that. So I called Sean. I said, Sean, Eric. And he said, hey, Eric, hey, I talked to Conrad today, and I know I said some stuff about you on my show. He goes, about, whatever. I said, Sean, no worries. We're friends. But I got a question for you, Sean. Back when this DX thing happened, when did you do that? And of course, Sean doesn't remember the details, much better than I do. But I said, now, Sean, our show started at 8:00. Yours didn't start till 9. He goes, yeah, I remember we had to hurry up and go do that thing and go do your thing because we had to race back and do our show. Uh-huh. So it's possible that I do remember this correctly. That you guys did. In fact, it was probably done in parts throughout the day because that's how pre-tapes work. I don't know. Maybe you can talk to Bruce about this. But maybe, just maybe, I'm not saying definitively. I'm not going to go to my grave with it, pounding a table saying it happened. But I'm going to suggest that maybe we do a little more digging. Maybe we talk to Craig Leathers. Maybe I reach out to Doug Dillinger. And by the way, I've got to call into Janie Engel, who lives down in Texas. She talks to Doug. And we're going to find out. We're going to get to the bottom of this. Did the DX invasion happen? Did the guys try to get in the back door of the building while Nitro was taking place? And is my version of how that went down the truth? Or is this just another Dave Meltzer bunch of bullshit?
Well, the fight will continue. I'm going to cuss and fuss and yell as we move forward, but next week is probably going to be a little different. I feel like we should maybe do more of a celebration of Dusty Rhodes and just let you sort of take the wheel and talk about your memories of the man, not just in front of the camera, but behind the scenes. And it will be a little less structured than what we've done so far here on 83 Weeks because we're coming up on a sad anniversary and we want to sort of celebrate the American Dream's life and times and his influence over your career. Give everybody a taste of what we might talk about next week when we cover Dusty Rhodes.
I want to talk about my very first memory of Dusty Rhodes, the professional wrestler. This is long before I ever got into the business and long before I ever dreamt I would have been in the business. The very first time I remember seeing the American Dream Dusty Rhodes on TV.
We're going to do it next week, boys and girls. Set your calendars. We would love to have your follow on Twitter at 83 Weeks. He is at eBischoff. I am at Hey, it's Conrad. Of course, check us out on YouTube as well. You can catch us every week here at 83weeks.com. But most importantly, if you haven't already, go to twitch.tv/83 Weeks. Eric, tell everybody what you're doing over there.
Well, on Tuesdays, the show drops obviously, midnight on Sunday night. So people have all day long to download the show and listen to it. So on Tuesdays at 8:00 Eastern, I go on twitch.tv/83 Weeks and I do a show called Breakdown. And the idea of that show is we interact live. We can chat live. I'm on camera. I can see your chats. You can see everybody else's chat. It's kind of a community chat room with a live television component with it. And we break down the show. questions that people have that maybe didn't come up during the podcast, or perhaps they heard something in the podcast that they want clarity on, or perhaps, as is often the case, they hear something that they either agree or disagree with and want to dig into more deeply. So that show is called Breakdown. It's Tuesday nights, 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 Central, twitch.tv/83 weeks, and we have a boatload of fun.
We're going to have a boatload of fun at StarCast, too. If you've been under a rock, I do want to mention that StarCast still has some weekend GA passes. You won't be able to see our stage shows, but you will be able to get to do lots of meet and greets with a lot of your favorite superstars, including the one and only Eric Bischoff. So if you haven't already, make plans to join all the fun over Labor Day weekend in Chicago. Of course, All In is going down that weekend. And then, of course, our show. If you were lucky enough to snag some tickets, let me tell you, you've got some fun stuff coming your way. You're going to have a Monday Night Wars debate on Thursday, August 30th with both Bruce Pritchard and Eric Bischoff. And I just confirmed that one of the biggest stars in Monday Night War history just changed their flight. They're no longer coming in on Friday. They're coming in on Thursday specifically to see this debate. I don't want to say who it is, but it's going to be fun. We've also got a bit of an NWO reunion that we're going to be doing on Saturday. It's going to be for X-Pac's podcast, which if you haven't already, you should certainly check out. X-Pac 12360. Pretty good stuff. They're going to be covering the reunion of the NWO with Waltman, Hall, Nash, and of course Eric Bischoff. And then maybe the main event of Saturday, the death of WCW. RD Reynolds is going to try to take Eric to task. He's got his work cut out for him because he's in training right now with me every week here on this podcast. So make plans to join us. Starcast.com is the place to get all the details. STARRCAST.com. And we have done a marathon show for you today, but I had fun talking about one of the greats of all time, Mr. Chris Jericho. And this is the last question of the show, and I saved it for a reason. Lots of people